What if one of the smallest countries in Europe once controlled an empire that stretched from Brazil to South Africa, from the Caribbean to Indonesia? An empire built not by royal decree or military conquest alone, but by merchants, investors, and trade companies. The Dutch Empire was never the largest nor the longest lasting. Yet, for a time, it was the richest and most connected. At its height, the tiny Dutch Republic stood at the center of a global web of commerce, culture, conflict, and colonization. This is the story of how a patchwork of provinces in the Low Countries transformed into a global maritime power, a journey that begins in medieval towns and ends in post-colonial debates about legacy, identity, and justice. Over the next several hours, we will follow the rise, expansion, and eventual unraveling of the Dutch Empire. We will meet merchants and monarchs, enslaved people and soldiers, artists and revolutionaries. We will see how trade, war, religion, and ideas shaped one of history's most influential, but often overlooked, empires. From the cobbled streets of Amsterdam to the plantations of Suriname, from the Spice Islands of the East Indies to the shores of Manhattan, this is the entire story of the Dutch Empire, told in full, with clarity, context, and care. The story of the Dutch Empire does not begin with empire at all. It begins in muddy marshlands, scattered villages, and wind-battered towns along the North Sea. In the early medieval period, around the year 1000, the land we now call the Netherlands was a patchwork of swamps, sandbanks, forests, and flood-prone rivers. Life was difficult. Much of the land was either submerged or constantly at risk of being reclaimed by the sea. And yet, by the year 1500, this same region had become one of the wealthiest and most urbanized parts of Europe. Its people had not only tamed the landscape, but turned it into an engine of commerce. This transformation, from marshlands to merchant towns, would lay the foundations for a global empire in the centuries to come. In the early Middle Ages, the Low Countries were not a unified nation. Instead, they were a collection of counties, duchies, and bishoprics loosely connected under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire. There was no Netherlands as such, only regions like Flanders, Holland, Brabant, and Utrecht. These were governed by local lords, often in competition with one another, and influenced by both German and French-speaking rulers. Despite their political fragmentation, the people of the Low Countries had one advantage that few others in Europe could match: geography. Situated at the delta of major rivers like the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt, the region became a natural crossroads between northern and southern Europe. Goods from England, France, Germany, and the Baltic Sea passed through its ports. By the 12th and 13th centuries, coastal cities like Bruges, Ghent, and later Antwerp and Amsterdam began to flourish. They developed markets, attracted artisans, and connected with the expanding trade networks of the North Sea and the Hanseatic League. Wool from England, salt from France, fish from Scandinavia, and grain from the Baltic flowed through their harbors. One of the most important drivers of this growth was the rise of the cloth industry. Flanders, in particular, became famous for its high-quality woolen cloth, woven by skilled artisans in towns like Ypres and Leuven. This industry created wealth, urban jobs, and a growing class of merchants who began to challenge the traditional power of feudal nobility. The cities in the Low Countries were also unusual in their level of self-governance. While kings and dukes ruled the countryside, many urban centers gained charters that allowed them to elect councils, raise taxes, and enforce local laws. These freedoms gave rise to a strong civic identity and a sense of autonomy that would remain deeply rooted in Dutch political culture. By the 14th century, Flanders had become one of the most densely populated and urbanized regions in Europe. Its cities were bustling with traders, bankers, and guild members. But with prosperity came conflict. The wealth of the merchant class often clashed with the power of noble elites and foreign rulers. This tension would shape the political story of the Low Countries for centuries. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the region came under the control of the Dukes of Burgundy. Through a combination of marriage, inheritance, and military conquest, the Burgundian dynasty, originally based in modern-day France, consolidated large parts of the Low Countries into a semi-coherent state. Philip the Bold, the first Burgundian duke to rule parts of the Netherlands, began acquiring territories through his marriage to Margaret of Flanders. His successors, including John the Fearless and Philip the Good, expanded Burgundian control across Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, and Hainaut. Philip the Good, who ruled from the early 1500s, even established a capital in Bruges and later moved his court to Brussels. Under Burgundian rule, the cities of the Netherlands enjoyed a degree of protection and economic stability. The dukes supported trade, invested in infrastructure, and maintained links with major European powers. But they also demanded loyalty and taxes, and they sought to centralize power in a way that often frustrated local leaders. This growing centralization led to resistance. In places like Ghent and Bruges, citizens rose in rebellion against new taxes or military conscription. In one notable case in the year 1437, the people of Ghent revolted against Philip the Good's attempt to levy a salt tax, leading to violent clashes and long-term resentment. Despite these conflicts, the 15th century was a time of remarkable economic and cultural growth. Antwerp rose to prominence as a key port, eventually surpassing Bruges in international trade. The Low Countries became known for their precision craftsmanship, shipbuilding, and advanced financial systems. Merchants from the Netherlands traded as far as the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and even North Africa. Dutch ships were increasingly seen on long-distance routes, carrying everything from wool to spices. Meanwhile, in the countryside, farmers adapted to growing market demands, shifting from subsistence farming to cash crops like flax and hops. The prosperity of the cities also gave rise to early banking institutions and innovations in credit. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, and joint ventures became more common. These tools would later be essential in financing colonial enterprises and overseas ventures. At the same time, the people of the Low Countries were becoming more literate, more connected, and more conscious of their identity. Printing presses, first introduced in the later 15th century, helped spread new ideas about trade, governance, and religion. Urban schools and universities supported learning, while artists and scholars from the Netherlands began to contribute to the broader European Renaissance. While most of Europe remained dominated by landed aristocracies, the Low Countries developed a distinctive model, a society where burghers, urban citizens, held real power, where commerce shaped politics, and where practical knowledge was often valued more than noble blood. By the year 1500, the region that had once been seen as marginal and marshy had become central to Europe's economy. Its people had dug canals, built seawalls, and reclaimed land from the water. They had turned city-states into trading hubs and merchants into political actors. But this prosperity made the Low Countries a prize. In the coming decades, the Burgundian inheritance would pass into the hands of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, linking the Netherlands to Spain, Austria, and the growing tensions of early modern Europe. Religious conflict, rebellion, and eventually empire were on the horizon. The foundations were now in place, but the struggle for independence was just beginning. At the turn of the 16th century, the prosperity of the Low Countries was well established. Trade flourished, cities thrived, and local governance had evolved through centuries of commercial autonomy and civic organization. But the region's growing wealth and strategic position also attracted more direct involvement from powerful rulers. The most important of these was the Habsburg dynasty, a name that would dominate European politics for centuries and forever alter the fate of the Dutch provinces. In the year 1500, Charles of Ghent was born in the city of the same name. he would become known as Charles V, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. Through a web of dynastic inheritance, he became ruler of the Habsburg Netherlands, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor. The Low Countries were no longer under Burgundian dukes, but part of a sprawling trans-European empire. Initially, the connection between Charles and the Low Countries was personal and pragmatic. Charles had been born and raised there. He spoke the local languages and had deep ties to the region's nobility. His early rule did not disrupt local traditions too sharply. In fact, Charles V maintained the privileges of the various provinces and worked with the regional estates to gather taxes and raise troops. However, this fragile balance began to shift as his empire grew and his attention turned to centralization and uniformity. Charles faced challenges across his vast domains: wars in Italy, rivalry with France, defense against the Ottoman Empire, and growing unrest within the Holy Roman Empire. To fund these campaigns, he increased taxes across his territories, including the Netherlands. At the same time, he introduced measures to streamline governance and bring greater unity to his diverse holdings. This included appointing Spanish officials, merging administrative regions, and enforcing imperial authority over local customs. But perhaps the greatest challenge to Charles's rule was religious. In 1517, Martin Luther published his 95 Theses in Wittenberg, launching what would become the Protestant Reformation. The movement spread rapidly across German-speaking lands and soon, the Low Countries. Lutheran, Calvinist, and Anabaptist ideas gained traction, especially in urban areas where literacy was high and discontent with the Catholic hierarchy had been simmering. Charles V, a staunch Catholic, viewed Protestantism as a direct threat not only to religious unity, but also to imperial authority. He responded with force. In the Netherlands, he issued edicts banning heretical books and punishing those who preached or printed Protestant teachings. Thousands were arrested, tortured, or executed. One of the most infamous examples was the execution of two Anabaptist leaders in the city of Leeuwarden in 1535, who were burned at the stake for refusing to renounce their beliefs. Despite repression, Protestantism continued to grow. The economic strength and independence of Dutch cities gave them the resilience to resist both religious persecution and royal overreach. Printing presses smuggled Bibles and pamphlets into the country. Underground churches met in secret. By the mid-16th century, Calvinism had become especially influential in cities like Antwerp, Ghent, and Leiden. Unlike the more hierarchical Lutheran tradition, Calvinism emphasized local congregational control, which resonated with Dutch traditions of civic autonomy. In 1555, Charles V abdicated, weary of war and burdened by the complexity of his empire. He divided his holdings between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip. Philip, soon to be known as Philip II, became King of Spain and ruler of the Habsburg Netherlands. With this transfer, the Dutch provinces were now under the rule of a Spanish monarch based in Madrid, who had little personal connection to the region and even less patience for its independent traditions. Philip II was devout, disciplined, and determined to strengthen royal control. From the outset, his policies alienated many in the Low Countries. He imposed new taxes, reinforced religious persecution, and ignored the traditional privileges of provincial assemblies. His appointment of foreign bishops and advisors deepened resentment among the local nobility, who saw their authority and influence slipping away. One of Philip's most controversial decisions was the creation of new bishoprics across the Netherlands in 1559. This reorganization of the church hierarchy was intended to strengthen Catholic discipline and counter Protestant growth. However, it also meant that more ecclesiastical power was placed in the hands of Spanish-aligned clergy, undermining local religious institutions and fueling fears of cultural domination. At the same time, Philip's Inquisition policies intensified. The number of executions for heresy rose dramatically. According to some estimates, thousands of individuals were executed in the Netherlands during this period for religious nonconformity. Public burnings became common, intended as a warning to others. But rather than suppressing dissent, these acts often provoked outrage and defiance. Opposition began to coalesce. In the early 1560s, A group of nobles and landowners formed what came to be known as the Compromise of the Nobles. They petitioned Philip to relax his religious policies and restore traditional privileges. They feared not only for their own power, but for the stability of the country as a whole. When the petition was presented to Margaret of Parma, Philip's half-sister and regent of the Netherlands, it was met with caution, but ultimately dismissed. As tensions rose, so did acts of defiance. In 1566, a wave of iconoclastic riots, known as the Beeldenstorm, swept through parts of the Netherlands. In city after city, Protestant crowds stormed Catholic churches, smashing statues, altars, and religious paintings. These were not coordinated uprisings, but spontaneous eruptions of long-suppressed anger. While some local officials tried to restrain the violence, others looked the other way. The Beeldenstorm shocked the Spanish court. To Philip II, this was not merely religious vandalism, it was rebellion. In response, he sent the Duke of Alba, one of his most trusted military commanders, to crush the unrest. Alba arrived in 1567 with a powerful army and sweeping powers. He established the Council of Troubles, quickly dubbed the Council of Blood by locals, which arrested and executed hundreds of suspected rebels and heretics. Among the most prominent victims were Lamoral, Count of Egmont, and Philip of Montmorency, Count of Horn, two noblemen who had once served the Spanish crown but were now viewed as traitors. This wave of repression only deepened resistance. Many Dutch leaders fled into exile, including William of Orange, who would soon return as a central figure in the revolt. The Low Countries, once seen as a jewel in the Habsburg crown, were now on the edge of open war. By the late 1560s, the stage was set for full-scale rebellion. What had begun as a struggle over taxes, religious freedom, and political autonomy was becoming something much larger. A fight for independence, identity, and control over the future. By the mid-16th century, the Low Countries were teetering on the edge of open conflict. Years of political centralization, religious repression, and economic strain had eroded trust in the Spanish crown. The appointment of the Duke of Alba, with his harsh judicial policies and military presence, confirmed the worst fears of many in the provinces. What began as protest and petition now escalated into armed resistance. Over the next 2 decades, the Dutch would fight not just for reform or toleration, but for independence and the right to govern themselves. The Dutch Revolt, also known as the 80 Years' War, formally began in the year 1568 when William of Orange, also known as William the Silent, led an invasion into the Netherlands from exile in Germany. A member of the high nobility and former loyal servant of the Spanish crown, William had become one of the most important voices of opposition. He had witnessed the brutal crackdown under the Duke of Alba and had concluded that peaceful negotiation was no longer possible. William's early military campaigns were mixed. His first invasion was repelled, and much of his initial support came from mercenaries rather than regular troops. However, his actions provided a rallying point for various factions: Protestant rebels, Catholic nobles disillusioned with Spanish policies, and urban populations tired of heavy taxation and persecution. The revolt began to take on a broader shape, both religious and political, local and national. One of the key developments during this early phase was the rise of the Sea Beggars, irregular Dutch naval forces composed of exiled Calvinists, pirates, and adventurers. In April of 1572, they captured the port city of Brielle in a surprise attack. This event proved a turning point. It inspired uprisings in other cities and gave the rebellion its first territorial foothold. Soon, several provinces and cities in Holland and Zeeland declared their support for the revolt. In response, the Spanish crown sent additional troops and resources. The conflict became increasingly brutal, with sieges, massacres, and scorched earth tactics on both sides. The sack of Antwerp in 1576 by mutinous Spanish troops shocked Europe and deeply alienated even Catholic loyalists within the Netherlands. Spanish soldiers, unpaid and starving, looted the city, killing thousands and burning entire districts. Known as the Spanish Fury, this event pushed many previously neutral provinces toward cooperation with the rebels. Later that same year, representatives from 17 provinces met in the city of Ghent and signed the Pacification of Ghent. This agreement was remarkable in that it united both Catholic and Protestant provinces in a call for the withdrawal of Spanish troops and the restoration of traditional liberties. Though the unity would not last long, the pacification symbolized a shared rejection of foreign military rule. But the path to independence was far from straightforward. Religious divisions soon re-emerged. While the northern provinces, such as Holland and Zeeland, embraced Calvinism, many southern provinces remained Catholic and grew uneasy with the growing influence of Protestant militias. By the early 1580s, the Spanish were able to regain control over much of the south, including Flanders and Brabant, with the help of loyalist nobles and a more pragmatic governor, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma. Still, the northern provinces held firm. In 1579, they formed the Union of Utrecht, a defensive alliance pledging mutual support against Spanish aggression. This union became the constitutional foundation for what would eventually become the Dutch Republic. In contrast, the southern provinces, led by the Union of Arras, reaffirmed their loyalty to the Spanish crown. The country was now irreversibly divided. 2 years later, in 1581, the leaders of the Union of Utrecht issued the Act of Abjuration. This declaration formally renounced Philip II as their sovereign, stating that a ruler who oppresses his people and violates their rights forfeits the legitimacy to govern. The Act of Abjuration is often compared to later documents such as the English Bill of Rights or the American Declaration of Independence. It was a bold statement of self-determination, unprecedented in European history at the time. However, independence was not yet secure. The fledgling republic still needed international recognition and military support. Leaders sought help from various European powers, including Elizabeth of England and the Duke of Anjou from France. These efforts had limited success. The English provided some military aid, but avoided full commitment. The French alliance failed when the Duke of Anjou tried to seize power in Antwerp, damaging trust among the Dutch. Meanwhile, William of Orange continued to serve as the symbolic and political leader of the rebellion. He advocated for religious toleration and a broad-based resistance movement. But in 1584, tragedy struck. William was assassinated in Delft by a Catholic zealot named Balthazar Gerard. The assassin acted under the belief that killing William would save Catholicism and restore Spanish control. Instead, it martyred the rebel leader and further hardened Dutch resolve. After William's death, leadership passed to his son, Maurice of Nassau. Maurice proved to be an able military commander and administrator. Under his leadership and with the support of key advisors such as Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the Dutch began to win significant victories. They recaptured important cities, reorganized their army, and improved their defensive infrastructure. By 1588, the Dutch Revolt had entered a new phase. The Spanish Armada, launched that year to invade England, was famously defeated, weakening Spanish prestige and encouraging Protestant states across Europe. The Dutch Republic, though still fighting, had survived more than 2 decades of war and repression. It had developed its own political institutions, military strategies, and sense of national identity. What began as a revolt against taxation and religious persecution had now evolved into a full-fledged revolution. The Dutch were no longer simply seeking reforms or religious freedom. They were building a new kind of state, one not based on monarchy or divine right, but on provincial cooperation, civic participation, and international trade. The Spanish would continue to fight for control, and peace was still a long way off. But by the end of the 1580s, the Dutch Republic had proven it could endure. It had claimed its place as a self-governing entity in a Europe still dominated by kings and emperors. By the end of the 1580s, the Dutch Revolt had shifted from a desperate struggle for survival into a war of endurance. The young Dutch Republic, still fighting off Spanish forces and lacking formal recognition, was beginning to carve out its own place in the European order. The next 60 years would be marked by diplomatic maneuvering, ideological formation, and gradual consolidation of independence. It was during this period that the Dutch truly began to define what kind of nation they were becoming. The structure of their republic, their role in international trade, and their cultural identity all began to take clearer form. And while the war with Spain would continue, the Dutch showed that they could defend their autonomy, not only with swords and ships, but with negotiation, resilience, and economic strength. After the assassination of William of Orange, leadership had passed to his son, Maurice of Nassau. Unlike his father, Maurice was not a politician, but a soldier. He focused on strengthening the military and retaking strategic towns. Under his command, the Dutch army introduced innovative tactics, including the use of disciplined volley fire and systematic siege warfare. These improvements allowed the Republic to hold its own against Spain, even though it remained vastly outnumbered and underfunded. Maurice was supported by Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, a senior statesman and legal mind who played a critical role in building the institutions of the new republic. He worked to formalize the Union of Utrecht, strengthen the States General, and attract foreign alliances. Oldenbarnevelt believed in diplomacy and commerce as the foundation of Dutch strength, while Maurice remained focused on military power and Protestant unity. These two visions would soon clash. But before that confrontation came, the Republic enjoyed a moment of peace, a much-needed pause in the long war. In 1609, the Dutch and Spanish crowns agreed to a ceasefire known as the 12 Years' Truce. This truce was not a formal recognition of independence, but it acknowledged the realities on the ground. The northern provinces were effectively self-governing, and both sides were exhausted from decades of warfare. The truce had significant consequences. It allowed the Dutch to redirect their energies from war to commerce, culture, and internal development. Amsterdam began to rise in prominence, replacing Antwerp, now under Spanish control, as the principal trade hub of Northern Europe. Dutch merchants expanded their reach into the Baltic, the Mediterranean, and across the Atlantic. Shipyards flourished, banks and insurance houses grew more sophisticated. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1600, began its overseas ventures in earnest during this period. Domestically, the truce created space for new political debates. One of the most divisive was a theological conflict within Dutch Protestantism. On one side were the followers of Jacobus Arminius, who emphasized free will and tolerance. On the other were the strict Calvinists, or Gomarists, who insisted on predestination and doctrinal purity. What might have remained an internal church debate quickly escalated into a political crisis. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt supported the more moderate Arminians, viewing them as compatible with a pluralistic and mercantile republic. Maurice of Nassau sided with the strict Calvinists, believing that religious unity was necessary for national strength. Tensions rose throughout the early 16-teens. In 1619, Maurice used his military authority to arrest Oldenbarnevelt on charges of treason. Despite appeals for clemency, Oldenbarnevelt was executed, an act that shocked many and revealed the growing tensions between military and civilian authority in the Republic. With Oldenbarnevelt gone, Maurice held undisputed control. However, his later years were less successful, and he struggled to maintain unity among the provinces. After his death in 1625, leadership passed to his younger half-brother Frederick Henry, who proved more balanced in his approach. Frederick Henry was a skilled diplomat and general, overseeing a renewed period of military success and civic development. He helped recapture key cities and continued to strengthen the Dutch position abroad. Meanwhile, in Europe more broadly, war was breaking out again. The 30 Years' War, which erupted in the Holy Roman Empire in 1618, drew in multiple European powers and reshaped the political landscape. Though the Dutch Republic was not a formal participant at first, it stood to benefit from Spain's growing distractions and weakening resources. By the late 1630s, the Dutch were ready to resume their fight for formal independence. Under the leadership of Frederick Henry and later his son William II, the Dutch army pushed deeper into Spanish-held territory. At the same time, Dutch diplomats worked closely with France and other enemies of Spain to bring the long war to a close. These efforts culminated in the Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648. This series of treaties ended both the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Dutch Republic. In the Westphalia Agreement, Spain formally recognized the independence of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. For the first time, the Dutch Republic stood as a sovereign state under international law. The Peace of Westphalia had wide-reaching implications. It marked the decline of Spanish power and the rise of new European powers, including France and the Dutch Republic. It also established a new diplomatic order based on the sovereignty of states, a concept that would influence international relations for centuries. For the Dutch, independence was more than a political status. It was the affirmation of their identity, a decentralized republic built on trade, religious diversity, and pragmatic governance. The Long War had tested their endurance, but it had also unified their provinces in ways that centuries of feudal rule never had. In the aftermath of peace, the Dutch Republic entered what many historians call its golden age. The coming decades would see unprecedented growth in commerce, science, and the arts. The Netherlands, once a vulnerable collection of provinces caught between empires, was now a global power in its own right. With the signing of the Peace of Westphalia in the year 1648, the Dutch Republic stood fully recognized as a sovereign power. But long before the ink had dried, the Dutch were already building a very different kind of empire, one not based on dynastic marriage or military conquest alone, but on commerce, navigation, and innovation. At the heart of this transformation was the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. This single institution would go on to reshape the Republic's global presence and leave an enduring, if controversial, legacy in world history. The VOC was founded in the year 1600 as a response to a problem and an opportunity. The Portuguese and Spanish crowns, unified under Philip II and later Philip III, had dominated the lucrative spice trade with Asia for much of the 16th century. Portuguese ships sailed to Goa, Malacca, and the Moluccas to bring back valuable goods like cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, which were sold in Europe at enormous profit. Dutch merchants, eager to break into this trade, had already begun launching their own expeditions in the 1590s. But they soon realized that competing against well-established Iberian powers required something more than individual ambition. They needed coordination, capital, and protection. The States General of the Dutch Republic, recognizing both the strategic and economic stakes, granted a charter to create a unified company. This new organization would have exclusive rights to trade in Asia on behalf of the Republic. The VOC was not just a trading company, it was the world's first multinational corporation. It could raise capital through public share offerings, maintain its own navy, establish colonies, negotiate treaties, and even wage war. Investors from across the Dutch Republic bought shares in the company, tying the fortunes of the citizenry directly to overseas expansion. Its central board, known as the Heren 17th, meaning the 17 Lords, represented chambers from various Dutch cities, including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Hoorn, Delft, and Enkhuizen. Though Amsterdam held the greatest influence, decision-making was distributed among different regions, reflecting the decentralized nature of the Republic itself. The first major VOC expedition set sail in 1601 under the command of Stephen van der Hagen. Within a few years, Dutch ships were establishing footholds along the coasts of India, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and the Indonesian archipelago. The goal was not merely to trade, but to control. The VOC aimed to dominate the production and distribution of spices at their source, cutting out middlemen and competitors. The company's most significant achievement during this early period was the founding of Batavia in 1619 on the island of Java. Built on the ruins of the Javanese port city of Jayakarta, Batavia became the headquarters of the VOC in Asia. It was both a trading hub and a fortified colonial outpost, designed to project Dutch power across the region. From Batavia, the VOC launched a series of military campaigns and diplomatic missions aimed at securing control of key islands in the Indonesian archipelago. In particular, the company targeted the so-called Spice Islands, the Banda Islands, and the Moluccas. where nutmeg, mace, and cloves grew in abundance. These spices were not only in high demand in Europe, but also extremely valuable per unit of weight, making them ideal for long-distance trade. Competition in these areas was fierce. Portuguese forces still held some positions, and local rulers often played European powers against one another. The VOC responded with a combination of negotiation, force, and monopolistic practices. In many cases, they coerced or eliminated rivals. One of the most notorious examples came in 1621, when the VOC, under the leadership of Jan Pieter Zoon Koen, violently suppressed resistance on the Banda Islands. The native population was massacred or deported, and the VOC repopulated the islands with slaves and imported laborers. Koen defended these actions as necessary for securing the spice monopoly, famously declaring that, "We cannot make war without trade, nor trade without war." His policies set a precedent for the VOC's future operations. Ruthlessly pragmatic, profit-driven, and unconcerned with local well-being. Despite the violence, the company's success was undeniable. Dutch ships began returning to the ports of Zeeland and Holland laden with nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, silk, tea, porcelain, and textiles. The VOC established permanent factories, essentially trading posts fortified against rivals, in places as far apart as Surat in India, Deshima in Japan, and the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. Trade with Japan, in particular, was a unique achievement. When the Tokugawa shogunate expelled most Europeans from Japan in the 1630s due to fears of Christian missionary influence, the Dutch were allowed to remain as the sole Western trading partner. But the conditions were strict. Dutch merchants could only trade from the man-made island of Deshima in Nagasaki Bay and were not allowed to bring Christian texts or conduct religious activities. This arrangement gave the Dutch a near monopoly on Japanese-European exchange for nearly 2 centuries. It also meant that Dutch knowledge, scientific, medical, and artistic, played a special role in Japanese intellectual life during the period of Japanese isolation. Back in Europe, the VOC's profits helped transform the Dutch economy. Amsterdam became a global financial center. Its stock exchange, founded in the early 17th century, was the first of its kind and served as a model for later markets in London and Paris. Dutch merchants and investors, flush with wealth from Asia, built elaborate canal houses, funded universities, and sponsored painters, scientists, and philosophers. But the wealth also came at a cost. The VOC's operations depended heavily on coercion, forced labor, and military occupation. While it claimed to represent the commercial interests of the Republic, in practice, it acted like a private empire. Entire communities in Asia were uprooted or enslaved to support the company's spice monopolies. The VOC's employees, both Dutch and local, lived in harsh conditions, and mortality rates on ships and in outposts were high. By the mid-17th century, the VOC had established itself as the dominant European power in the Indian Ocean. It had driven out most Portuguese competitors, contained British ambitions in the region, and built a network of trade routes that stretched from the Cape of Good Hope to Nagasaki. It was, in many ways, a state within a state. And yet, the Dutch East India Company was more than just a commercial entity. It was the foundation of Dutch overseas empire. Its actions shaped the political geography of Southeast Asia, influenced global trade systems, and left cultural legacies that still echo today. Its story is inseparable from the larger story of the Dutch Republic, how a small group of provinces, having thrown off imperial rule at home, turned outward and began building an empire of their own. The founding of the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th century had given the Dutch Republic a powerful instrument to project its influence far beyond European shores. But trade alone could not sustain the ambitions of the company or the Republic. What followed in the decades after the establishment of Batavia was not just commercial expansion, but a determined, calculated campaign to secure direct control over the sources of wealth in the East Indies. From around the year 1605 onward, the VOC moved from being a trading partner to being a regional power. It expanded its presence through diplomacy, coercion, and open warfare. The most important theater of this transformation was the Indonesian archipelago, particularly the Moluccas and Banda Islands, known to Europeans as the Spice Islands. These islands were the world's primary source of nutmeg, cloves, and mace, three spices that held enormous value in early modern Europe. Used for preserving food, flavoring dishes, and even believed to have medicinal and protective properties, spices were a luxury product that could command high prices in Amsterdam, London, or Paris. Control of these commodities offered not just profit but strategic leverage in the increasingly global economy. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Dutch had to contend with two main obstacles in the region. First, the Portuguese already maintained outposts in parts of the archipelago, having established a presence there in the 16th century. Second, the local sultanates and kingdoms had their own networks of trade, alliances, and resistance. These included the Sultanate of Ternate in the northern Moluccas and the rival Sultanate of Tidore, among others. The VOC's approach to overcoming these challenges combined military force with strategic diplomacy. In some cases, Dutch agents signed treaties with local rulers, promising military support in exchange for exclusive rights to the spice trade. In other instances, the company deployed its private army and naval power to force submission or to eliminate competition. One of the earliest and most dramatic examples of this strategy came with the Dutch campaign in the Banda Islands. The Bandanese had long traded nutmeg with multiple partners, including the Portuguese and later the English. They were reluctant to accept Dutch demands for an exclusive trade agreement. In response, the VOC launched a violent campaign in 1621, led by Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, then Governor-General of the company. Cohen's forces attacked the islands with overwhelming force. Villages were destroyed, and much of the native population was either killed or exiled. The remaining land was handed over to Dutch planters and foreign laborers, including enslaved people brought from elsewhere. The Bandanese nutmeg groves were turned into plantations, worked under strict VOC supervision. The conquest of Banda was brutal and remains one of the darkest episodes in early Dutch colonial history. But it achieved the VOC's goal. The company now had near total control over the nutmeg trade. Similar strategies were employed in the Moluccas, where Dutch forces worked to dismantle rival Portuguese and English claims and to assert dominance over native sultanates. Despite its aggressive posture, the VOC often relied on local alliances to maintain its control. In places like Ambon and Ternate, Dutch officials cooperated with indigenous rulers to manage day-to-day governance and security. In return, these rulers received military support against their enemies and access to VOC goods. But these relationships were unequal. The VOC dictated prices, imposed trade restrictions, and interfered in local succession politics to ensure favorable outcomes. As the 17th century progressed, the Dutch expanded their activities well beyond the Spice Islands. Java, the most populous and politically complex island in the region, became a major focus of VOC policy. Unlike the relatively small and scattered populations of the Banda and Moluccas, Java had multiple large cities, powerful kingdoms, and a deep agricultural base. Initially, the VOC confined itself to the coastal city of Batavia, using it as a headquarters and logistical hub. But over time, conflicts with the Javanese kingdoms, especially Mataram, drew the company into deeper involvement in the island's politics. The Dutch supplied weapons and troops to rival factions, interfered in royal succession disputes, and secured territorial concessions in return. By the middle of the 17th century, the VOC had carved out a growing sphere of influence on Java's north coast. These gains were often incremental, one port or treaty at a time. But over the decades, they added up to a significant colonial footprint. Batavia grew in size and importance, with its population made up of Dutch officials, Asian merchants, freed slaves, and a growing Eurasian community. Beyond Java and the Moluccas, the VOC established posts in Ceylon, Malacca, and the Malay Peninsula. In 1641, the company seized Malacca from the Portuguese, giving the Dutch control over the critical choke point between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. In Ceylon, Dutch forces ousted the Portuguese in alliance with the local kingdom of Kandy, though relations between the VOC and the Kandian kings later soured. Trade with China and Japan was another pillar of VOC strategy. In Japan, as noted earlier, the Dutch were the only Europeans allowed to trade under the Tokugawa shogunate's strict isolationist policies. Dutch merchants operated out of Deshima Island under tight regulations, but benefited from exclusive access to Japanese silver, porcelain, and copper. In return, the Dutch brought silk from China, spices from the Indies, and scientific knowledge from Europe. The VOC's system of global commerce was made possible by a sophisticated logistical network. Dutch ships operated on fixed circuits, sailing between Batavia, Ceylon, Bengal, and the Netherlands with regularity. Warehouses, shipyards, and forts dotted the Asian coastline, serving as nodes in this maritime web. Goods were carefully inventoried and prices were manipulated to ensure maximum profit. This infrastructure required not only sailors and merchants but also administrators, accountants, translators, and soldiers. The company maintained its own bureaucracy, legal code, and currency. In many areas, it effectively functioned as a state, issuing edicts, levying taxes, and enforcing contracts with its own courts and officials. Yet for all its power, the VOC was not invincible. Corruption, mismanagement, and internal disputes plagued its governance. Long supply chains and slow communication with Amsterdam meant that local decisions were often made without oversight. Company officials grew rich through private trading, known as privateering, at the expense of company profits. Complaints from shareholders grew louder as the century wore on. Moreover, the company's aggressive policies bred resistance. Revolts broke out periodically in the Moluccas, Java, and other territories. In some cases, the VOC responded with concessions, in others, with brutal reprisals. The company's reliance on military force to suppress dissent became increasingly costly, both financially and morally. By the end of the 17th century, the VOC had established itself as the preeminent European power in Southeast Asia. It controlled strategic ports, monopolized the spice trade, and influenced the politics of entire regions. But the foundations of its empire were not as stable as they appeared. Beneath the surface of order lay tensions between profit and governance, between Dutch officials and local populations, and between shareholders and administrators. The conquest of the East Indies was not completed in a single campaign or even a single generation. It was a gradual, uneven process that blended trade with war, alliance with exploitation. It brought great wealth to the Dutch Republic but left a legacy of disruption and domination across Asia. While the Dutch East India Company was expanding Dutch influence across Asia, another powerful institution was shaping Dutch ambitions in the Atlantic world. Founded in the year 1621, the Dutch West India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the WIC, was designed to mirror the structure of the VOC, but focused on the Americas and West Africa. It would become the driving force behind Dutch colonization in the Atlantic Basin, from sugar plantations in Brazil to slave forts along the Gold Coast of Africa. The Dutch Republic's interest in the Atlantic world was not simply about exploration or national prestige, it was about competition. Spain and Portugal had long dominated the seas under the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the non-European world between them. The Dutch, having thrown off Spanish rule, saw the Atlantic as an open arena, both economically and geopolitically. The WIC was granted a monopoly on Dutch trade and conquest in the Americas and West Africa. Like the VOC, it could raise armies, build forts, and govern territories. Its charter authorized it to wage war, especially against Spain and Portugal, who were still joined under the Spanish crown. At the time of the WIC's founding, the Dutch were in the middle of the 12 years truce with Spain, but that ceasefire ended in 1621, the same year the company was chartered. One of the WIC's first major goals was to disrupt Spanish and Portuguese shipping in the Atlantic. Dutch privateers, operating under the company's license, began raiding treasure fleets returning from the Americas. The most famous of these raids occurred in 1628, when Admiral Piet Hein, captured a Spanish silver fleet off the coast of Cuba. The haul was immense: silver, gold, and other goods valued at millions of Dutch guilders. The profits from that single raid financed Dutch military campaigns in Europe and validated the WIC's strategic value. But plunder alone was not enough to sustain a company. The WS quickly moved into colonization and trade. In 1624, Dutch settlers established the colony of New Netherland in North America. The colony stretched from the Delaware River in the south to the Hudson River and beyond. The main settlement was New Amsterdam, founded on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. This location, chosen for its natural harbor and access to inland rivers, would one day become the city of New York. New Netherland was primarily a commercial outpost. The Dutch traded furs with indigenous peoples, especially the Mohican and Mohawk nations, exchanging European goods like metal tools and firearms for valuable pelts. The colony was ethnically diverse from the beginning, home not only to Dutch settlers but also to Germans, Scandinavians, Africans, and Sephardic Jews fleeing Iberian persecution. However, the WIC struggled to attract large numbers of settlers. Unlike the English colonies in New England or Virginia, New Netherland lacked strong religious or political motivation for migration. Governance was top-down, and the company prioritized profit over settlement. Director generals like Peter Minuit and Peter Stuyvesant had to balance trade goals with security, indigenous diplomacy, and rising tension with English neighbors. While New Netherland developed slowly, Dutch activities in South America were far more ambitious and violent. In the 1630s, the WIC launched a bold campaign to seize control of Portuguese Brazil. At the time, Portugal was still united with Spain under the Iberian Union, making Portuguese colonies a legitimate target for Dutch attacks. In 1630, Dutch forces captured the city of Recife, and over the next few years they expanded their hold over the northeastern coast of Brazil. For a time, Dutch Brazil seemed poised to become the centerpiece of a new Atlantic empire. The colony was placed under the leadership of Johan Maurits of Nassau, a Dutch nobleman who governed from 1637 to 1644. Johan Maurits introduced reforms, built roads and fortifications, and promoted religious tolerance among the diverse population of Portuguese settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. He also brought scientists, artists, and cartographers to Brazil, turning Recife into a center of learning and observation. The detailed paintings of Franz Post and the ethnographic studies of Georg Markgraf and Willem Piso offered Europeans their first in-depth images of South American landscapes and cultures. In many ways, Dutch Brazil reflected the broader ambitions of the Dutch Republic: commercial, scientific, and strategic. But maintaining control over Brazil was difficult. The Portuguese colonists deeply resented Dutch rule and launched a guerrilla war known as the Luso-Brazilian Insurrection. After Portugal regained independence from Spain in 1640, the conflict intensified. Portuguese forces, supported by local militias and indigenous allies, gradually pushed back the Dutch. By 1654, Recife had fallen, and the Dutch were forced to abandon their last stronghold in Brazil. The loss of Brazil was a serious blow, but the Dutch remained active elsewhere in the Atlantic. In the Caribbean, they captured and fortified several islands, including Curaçao, Aruba, Bonaire, Saint Eustatius, and parts of Saint Martin. These islands became important nodes in the Dutch trade network, especially for sugar, salt, and enslaved labor. The Dutch also occupied parts of Suriname and Guyana on the northern coast of South America, areas that would remain in Dutch hands for much longer. Perhaps the most morally troubling aspect of Dutch expansion in the Atlantic was the role the WIC played in the transatlantic slave trade. From the mid-17th century onward, the Dutch operated slave forts along the West African coast, most notably at Elmina in modern-day Ghana. These forts were used to purchase enslaved Africans, often through local intermediaries, and transport them across the Atlantic to work on plantations in the Americas and Caribbean. The so-called triangle trade became a key part of the WIC's business. Dutch ships carried weapons, cloth, and alcohol to Africa. enslaved people to the Americas, and colonial goods like sugar, tobacco, and coffee back to Europe. The human cost was catastrophic. Tens of thousands of Africans were subjected to forced labor, family separation, and horrific conditions aboard slave ships and in the colonies. While Dutch society at home largely profited from this trade, public debates about its ethics were limited during this period. Only later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, would moral opposition begin to challenge the practice. But in the 17th century, slavery was seen by many European powers, including the Dutch, as a necessary component of global commerce. Back in North America, New Netherland continued to grow modestly under Dutch rule, but the colony remained vulnerable. The English, expanding northward from Virginia and southward from New England, viewed Dutch presence as an obstacle to their own imperial ambitions. In 1664, English forces under the command of the Duke of York seized New Amsterdam without a fight. The city was renamed New York, and the Dutch surrendered control of the colony. Though the loss was a humiliation, the Dutch managed to negotiate favorable terms. In 1667, through the Treaty of Breda, the Dutch agreed to cede New Netherland to the English in exchange for Suriname, which they had taken from the English during the Second Anglo-Dutch War. This trade reflected shifting priorities. While North America held long-term promise, the Dutch valued Suriname's sugar plantations more in the short term. By the late 17th century, the Dutch Atlantic Empire had taken its mature shape. Though they had lost New Netherland and Brazil, they retained valuable possessions in the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. These territories, though smaller in scale than those of Spain or England, formed a web of commercial outposts that contributed to the Dutch Republic's prosperity. The WIC, like the VOC, had operated as both a business and a colonial authority. Its legacy, too, was mixed. It had brought new trade networks, cultural exchange, and scientific knowledge, but also slavery, dispossession, and violence. Dutch influence in the Atlantic was now firmly established, setting the stage for continued competition with other European powers. In the 17th century, the newly independent Dutch Republic entered a remarkable period of cultural, scientific, and economic flourishing that would later be known as the Dutch Golden Age. Spanning much of the century, this era was defined by explosive growth in trade, innovation in the sciences, and artistic output that would shape the future of European culture. Uniquely, it emerged not under an absolute monarchy or imperial court, but within a decentralized republic governed by merchants, provincial councils, and city magistrates. The foundation of this golden age was trade. The republic had become the beating heart of European commerce. Dutch ships dominated the seas, carrying goods between Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Amsterdam, in particular, rose to global prominence as a hub of finance and distribution. Its harbor was filled with merchant vessels, its warehouses stocked with spices, textiles, sugar, timber, tobacco, and grains. One of the most significant innovations during this period was the establishment of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Created in the early 17th century, it allowed investors to buy and sell shares in companies like the VOC, enabling large-scale commercial enterprises to thrive. Financial instruments such as futures contracts and marine insurance matured in this environment, making the Republic a leader in modern finance. Trade was not limited to luxury goods. The Dutch also excelled in bulk commodities, the so-called mother trades, especially grain imports from the Baltic, ensured food security for the growing population and made Dutch shipping indispensable across northern Europe. Meanwhile, Dutch fishing fleets ventured into the North Sea to harvest herring, an essential part of the domestic and export economy. This vast commercial network created wealth on an unprecedented scale. Cities like Amsterdam, Haarlem, Delft, and Leiden expanded rapidly. Wealthy merchant families commissioned elegant canal houses and invested heavily in education, civic projects, and the arts. A prosperous middle class emerged, one that valued literacy, religious tolerance, and civic responsibility. This economic prosperity coincided with a golden age of Dutch art. Freed from the traditional demands of royal courts or the Catholic Church, artists began to focus on scenes of everyday life, landscapes, portraits, and still lifes. Their clients were not kings or bishops, but merchants, artisans, and professionals eager to display their taste and success. Rembrandt van Rijn became one of the most celebrated painters of this period. His mastery of light and shadow, emotional depth, and innovative compositions redefined portraiture and historical painting. Works such as The Night Watch and The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaas Tulp exemplify his ability to capture the energy and complexity of 17th-century Dutch society. Other notable artists included Johannes Vermeer, whose quiet interior scenes reflect domestic life with meticulous detail and subtle symbolism, Frans Hals, known for his dynamic and expressive portraits, and Rachel Ruijs, who specialized in detailed still lifes of flowers and insects. Together, these painters created a body of work that celebrated both the ordinary and the exceptional. The Dutch Golden Age also produced advances in science and technology. The Republic became a center of innovation, particularly in the fields of optics, astronomy, cartography, and biology. The close connection between maritime trade and scientific inquiry fueled this progress. Navigators needed accurate maps and instruments, and merchants demanded reliable measurements and forecasts. One of the most influential figures was Christian Huygens, a mathematician, astronomer, and physicist who developed the wave theory of light, improved telescope lenses, and invented the pendulum clock. He corresponded with scientists across Europe and was a founding member of the French Academy of Sciences. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a self-taught lensmaker, used a simple but powerful microscope to observe microorganisms, sperm cells, and bacteria for the first time. His discoveries opened an entirely new dimension of biology and earned him the title Father of Microbiology. His detailed letters to the Royal Society in London brought international attention to Dutch science. In the field of cartography, the Dutch produced some of the most accurate and beautiful maps of the early modern period. The Bleu family of mapmakers, operating out of Amsterdam, published atlases that combined geographic precision with artistic elegance. These maps were not just practical tools, they were also symbols of Dutch global awareness and ambition. Printing and publishing also thrived. The Dutch Republic became a safe haven for writers, philosophers, and religious dissenters from across Europe. Free from censorship found in many monarchies, Dutch printers published controversial works, including texts by Galileo, Descartes, and Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza, born into a Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, was one of the most radical thinkers of the time. His philosophy challenged traditional notions of God, morality, and politics. Although his ideas were too controversial for mainstream acceptance during his lifetime, his writings deeply influenced Enlightenment thinkers in the following century. This intellectual climate was supported by a well-educated public. Literacy rates in the Dutch Republic were among the highest in Europe, especially in urban areas. Schools were widely available, and many households owned books, including religious texts, almanacs, and scientific treatises. Public lectures, debates, and art exhibitions were common features of civic life. Religious pluralism also distinguished the Republic. While the Dutch Reformed Church was the official religion, other faiths were tolerated to an unusual degree. Catholics, Lutherans, Jews, and Anabaptists could live and worship with relative freedom, especially if they refrained from overt public displays. This policy, driven more by pragmatism than ideology, helped attract skilled immigrants and merchants to Dutch cities. Urban design and engineering flourished as well. The Dutch perfected techniques for land reclamation, water management, and canal building. Cities were carefully planned with concentric canals, straight streets, and public squares. The expansion of Amsterdam, known as the Grachtengordel, or Canal Belt, remains a remarkable example of early modern urban planning. All of this was underpinned by a political structure that was both innovative and complex. The Dutch Republic was a confederation of 7 provinces, each with its own local government and traditions. The States General, a federal assembly, coordinated foreign policy and defense, while the position of stadtholder, often held by members of the House of Orange, offered a kind of unifying military leadership. Tensions remained, particularly between Republican-minded regents in cities like Amsterdam and the Orangist supporters of a stronger central executive. These internal divisions would periodically surface, especially during times of war or crisis. But for much of the Golden Age, the balance held, allowing the Republic to function effectively. By the 1660s, however, cracks were beginning to appear. England had emerged as a major rival on the seas. The two nations clashed in a series of naval conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, disrupting trade and threatening Dutch supremacy. The Republic's decentralized political system also began to struggle with the growing demands of empire and defense. Yet even amid these challenges, the legacy of the Dutch Golden Age was secure. In just a few generations, the Dutch had transformed their small republic into a global leader in commerce, culture, and knowledge. Their ships sailed to every continent, their books were read across Europe, and their paintings would become some of the most admired in world history. This moment of extraordinary achievement had been made possible by the unique combination of independence, innovation, and internationalism that defined the Dutch spirit. But as the Republic turned outward with greater ambition, it would soon be tested by war, especially with its rising maritime rival, England. As the Dutch Republic reached the height of its golden age, its growing influence on the global stage began to draw the attention and eventually the hostility of rival powers. Chief among these was England. Both nations had risen to prominence through trade, maritime strength, and expansive overseas ambitions. But their commercial interests increasingly overlapped, setting the stage for a series of bitter conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars. These wars were not driven by ideology or religion. Instead, they were rooted in economic rivalry, fought over control of sea lanes, colonial outposts, and trading rights. Between the middle of the 17th century and the early 18th century, the Dutch and English engaged in three major naval wars that would test the limits of their maritime power and reshape the balance of empire in the Atlantic and beyond. The First Anglo-Dutch War broke out in the year 1652 during a period of political upheaval in both countries. In England, the monarchy had been overthrown following the Civil War, and Oliver Cromwell now ruled as Lord Protector under the Commonwealth. In the Dutch Republic, internal divisions continued between Republican leaders in Holland and the House of Orange, although the office of stadtholder had been left vacant following the death of William II in 1650. Tensions had been rising for years. Dutch traders had gained a dominant position in European shipping and controlled access to many Asian and American goods. English merchants and political leaders viewed this dominance with growing resentment. In response, the English Parliament passed the First Navigation Act in 1651, which required that all imports into England or its colonies be carried on English ships or those of the producing country. This act was a direct blow to Dutch commerce, which relied heavily on transporting goods produced by others. Dutch leaders considered the Navigation Act an act of economic aggression. Diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the dispute, and naval skirmishes soon escalated into full-scale war. The conflict was fought almost entirely at sea, with major battles in the English Channel and the North Sea. Although the Dutch had more merchant ships, the English Navy was better funded and more centralized. In several engagements, including the Battle of the Gabbard and the Battle of Scheveningen, English forces inflicted serious losses. The war ended in 1654 with the Treaty of Westminster, in which the Dutch agreed to respect the Navigation Acts, though they gained a few concessions in return. The outcome of the First War revealed the vulnerability of the Dutch Republic's decentralized military system. The States General took steps to improve naval readiness, increase shipbuilding, and professionalize command. One key figure who emerged during this period was Michiel de Ruyter, a skilled seaman and tactician who would soon become a national hero. The Second Anglo-Dutch War began in 1665. By now, the English monarchy had been restored under Charles II, and the rivalry between the two nations had only intensified. Both sought to expand their influence in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Colonial skirmishes erupted in places like the West African coast and the Caribbean, while tensions in Europe continued to simmer. Early in the war, the English captured the Dutch colony of New Netherland, renaming it New York in honor of the Duke of York, the king's brother. This marked a symbolic and strategic loss for the Dutch in North America. However, the Dutch would soon respond with force. Under the command of Michiel de Ruyter, the Dutch Navy launched several daring counterattacks. De Ruyter conducted successful raids along the West African coast to reclaim lost forts, fought fiercely in the Caribbean, and then returned to European waters for a series of major naval battles. The most spectacular Dutch victory came in the year 1667 during the raid on the Medway. In this bold operation, de Ruyter led a fleet up the River Medway in southern England, breaking through defensive chains and burning much of the English fleet at anchor near Chatham. The Dutch even captured the English flagship, the Royal Charles, towing it back to the Netherlands as a war trophy. The raid shocked the English public and humiliated the monarchy. It forced England to negotiate peace, and the war ended with the Treaty of Breda. The treaty confirmed England's control of New Netherland, but granted the Dutch permanent control of Suriname, which they had seized during the conflict. More importantly, the treaty recognized existing commercial and colonial holdings, reflecting a temporary balance of power. Despite the dramatic raid on the Medway, the war had been costly for both nations. The Dutch emerged with their pride restored, but they also faced increasing pressure from France, which under Louis XIV was becoming more aggressive in European politics. The Third Anglo-Dutch War broke out in 1672 and lasted until 1674. This time, the conflict was part of a broader European war, as France and England formed an alliance against the Dutch Republic. Louis XIV sought to expand French territory, while Charles II hoped to curb Dutch commercial dominance. This war posed an existential threat to the Republic. French armies invaded the eastern provinces, and English fleets returned to attack Dutch shipping. However, the Dutch response was swift and coordinated. The provinces rallied behind a new stadtholder, William III of Orange, grandson of the original William the Silent. William III became a unifying figure. Under his leadership, the Dutch Navy held off the English, while Dutch forces used a tactic known as the Holland Water Line, deliberately flooding low-lying lands to halt the French advance. These defenses, combined with diplomatic efforts and shifting alliances, eventually turned the tide. Once again, Michiel de Ruyter played a decisive role at sea. In the battles of Solbay, Schooneveld, and Texel, he used superior maneuvering and tactical skill to frustrate English and French plans. Though the Dutch did not win a total victory, they successfully prevented an invasion and preserved their independence. The war ended with the Treaty of Westminster in 1674. England withdrew from the alliance with France, and the Dutch retained most of their territories and trade privileges. The Third Anglo-Dutch War confirmed the resilience of the Republic, but revealed the growing complexity of European politics, where alliances could shift quickly and small states had to balance power carefully. In the years that followed, William III would emerge not only as a Dutch leader, but as a central figure in British history. In 1688, he would become King of England in the Glorious Revolution, further intertwining the destinies of the two former rivals. The Anglo-Dutch Wars were more than a series of naval battles. They represented a fundamental shift in the global balance of power, from fragmented mercantile competition to state-sponsored empire building. While the Dutch held their ground admirably, the wars marked the beginning of a slow but steady transition. England, with its larger population, growing navy, and centralized state, would eventually surpass the Dutch as the dominant maritime empire. Nonetheless, the Dutch Republic had proven itself. It had withstood 3 wars against a larger rival, defended its trading interests, and maintained its position as a global power. Yet maintaining this status would require new strategies, especially as its colonies continued to grow in importance. As the Dutch Republic emerged from its third naval war with England in the mid-17th century, it faced a new geopolitical reality. The Anglo-Dutch Wars had proven the Republic's military resilience and naval brilliance, but they had also exposed the vulnerabilities of its far-flung colonial holdings. One of the most visible signs of this shifting dynamic was the permanent loss of New Netherland, marking the end of Dutch territorial ambitions in North America and prompting a strategic reorganization of its global empire. The Dutch colony of New Netherland, centered on the port of New Amsterdam, had been established in the early 17th century as a commercial outpost rather than a settler colony. It served primarily as a base for fur trade with indigenous nations and as a foothold for Atlantic commerce. While its population grew over time and included a diverse mix of Dutch, German, Scandinavian, English, African, and Jewish residents, it never reached the size or cohesion of the English colonies to its north and south. The governance of New Netherland was firmly in the hands of the Dutch West India Company. Its most well-known Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, ruled the colony with a firm hand. Though a devout Calvinist and effective administrator, Stuyvesant clashed frequently with settlers who demanded greater religious tolerance and civic participation. This growing dissatisfaction weakened internal unity at a time when external threats were increasing. By the early 1660s, tensions between England and the Dutch Republic had reached a boiling point once again. Although formal war had not yet resumed, both nations sought to expand their influence in North America and the Caribbean. English colonial authorities viewed the Dutch colony as an obstacle to the consolidation of their eastern seaboard holdings. In the year 1664, King Charles II of England granted his brother, the Duke of York, a charter to seize New Netherland. English warships arrived in the harbor of New Amsterdam and demanded the surrender of the colony. Lacking military support from the Dutch Republic and facing internal divisions, Stuyvesant reluctantly capitulated. The English renamed the city New York, and New Netherland was no more. While the loss was a psychological blow to Dutch pride, it did not spell the end of Dutch power in the Atlantic. In fact, during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch retaliated by capturing the English colony of Suriname in South America. At the conclusion of hostilities, the Treaty of Breda in 1667 formalized the situation. The Dutch retained Suriname, while the English kept New Netherland. This trade-off reflected deeper strategic calculations. While North America offered long-term settlement potential, Suriname provided immediate economic value through its profitable sugar plantations. The Dutch Republic, focused on commerce rather than territorial expansion, opted to prioritize resource-rich colonies that could be worked through plantation labor. Suriname soon became the centerpiece of Dutch interests in the Guianas. Under Dutch administration, the colony's plantation economy expanded rapidly, producing sugar, coffee, and cocoa for European markets. This growth, however, came at a steep human cost. The colony became deeply dependent on enslaved African labor, with thousands of people transported across the Atlantic and forced to work under brutal conditions. Dutch Caribbean holdings also gained importance in this period. Islands such as Curaçao, Aruba, Bonaire, and Saint Eustatius became vital hubs for trade, logistics, and slavery. Curaçao, in particular, emerged as a major center for the transatlantic slave trade, acting as both a distribution point and a commercial gateway for Spanish-American markets. Saint Eustatius earned the nickname the Golden Rock due to its role as a free port. Goods flowed in and out with little regulation, and the island became a bustling entrepot for merchants of all nationalities. During times of war, it often served as a covert supplier to belligerents, maintaining Dutch neutrality while profiting from conflict. Meanwhile, in Africa, the Dutch West India Company strengthened its grip on key ports along the Gold Coast in present-day Ghana. Forts like Elmina and Fort Amsterdam served as key points in the slave trade, connecting European goods to African intermediaries who supplied enslaved individuals in exchange. These enslaved people were then transported to plantations in Suriname, the Caribbean, and occasionally to Dutch colonies in the Indian Ocean. Though these outposts were scattered, they functioned as an integrated system. Goods, people, and capital moved in a triangular pattern. Manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved Africans to the Americas, and raw materials like sugar, coffee, and indigo back to Europe. The Dutch Republic's economy, particularly its shipping and insurance sectors, reaped immense profits from this flow. The reshuffling of colonial priorities also led to structural changes in the Dutch West India Company itself. Unlike the VOC, which continued to thrive in Asia during the 17th century, the WIC faced ongoing financial instability. Its dependence on war, piracy, and slave trading made it vulnerable to both peace treaties and shifting moral attitudes. By the late 1670s, the WIC was burdened with debt and declining influence. A new iteration of the company, often referred to as the Second WS, was chartered in 1674, but it never achieved the scale or profitability of its predecessor. The VOC, with its spice monopolies and deeper roots in Asia, remained the stronger institution for now. Domestically, Dutch society began to adjust to the loss of New Netherland and the rise of plantation wealth from the Americas. While public attention still focused on European wars and Asian commerce, the Atlantic colonies played a growing role in shaping economic life and political debate. There were early signs of moral questioning around the slave trade, particularly among Dutch Mennonites and some Reformed theologians. However, these voices remained marginal, and economic interests largely outweighed ethical concerns. In cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Middelburg, merchant families invested in colonial ventures, reaped profits from Caribbean trade, and financed urban development and cultural patronage. As for New York, formerly New Amsterdam, it retained many elements of its Dutch past. Dutch legal customs, property systems, and street names persisted for decades. The legacy of religious tolerance and ethnic diversity that had characterized the colony also endured, influencing the development of the city well into the 18th century. In the broader context, the loss of New Netherland marked a shift in Dutch imperial thinking. The Republic increasingly prioritized commercially exploitable colonies over territorial possessions. Where Spain and England focused on empire as dominion, the Dutch increasingly focused on empire as a network, a web of ports, trading stations, and plantations designed to maximize profit with minimal governance. This model allowed the Dutch Republic to remain a formidable power in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, even as larger states like France and England began to develop more centralized and expansive colonial systems. The reshuffling of empire in the late 17th century was, in many ways, a pragmatic adaptation to geopolitical realities. Yet the strains of this model, built on slavery, forced labor, and economic extraction, would begin to show in the century that followed. As the Dutch sought to solidify their position in Java and beyond, they would soon confront new challenges in Asia, where commercial ambition increasingly merged with territorial ambition. As Dutch power expanded across the Indonesian archipelago in the 17th century, one location emerged as the administrative and symbolic heart of their empire in the east, Batavia. Founded in the year 1619 on the site of the former Javanese port city of Jayakarta, Batavia became not only the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, but also the central node of Dutch colonial governance in Asia. Over time, its influence would extend far beyond trade, as Java itself became the main stage for Dutch political, economic, and military dominance in the region. Unlike the Spice Islands, where the VOC had pursued monopolies through violent conquest and depopulation, Java posed a different challenge. It was not a scattered archipelago of minor kingdoms, but a densely populated island with rich agricultural resources and sophisticated political systems. By the early 17th century, central Java was dominated by powerful native states such as the Sultanate of Mataram, whose rulers claimed broad authority across the interior and maintained control over key rice-producing regions. From the very beginning, the Dutch approach to Java was a mix of commercial pragmatism and strategic interference. Batavia, situated on the northwestern coast of the island, was ideally placed for trade with China, India, and the broader archipelago. The Dutch built the city as a fortified enclave, modeled on European urban design with canals, walls, and Dutch-style houses. While it served as a base for VOC officials, soldiers, and European merchants, Batavia quickly became a multicultural city. Chinese traders, Malay laborers, Indian artisans, enslaved Africans, and Christianized Moluccans all contributed to its growth. Despite its European appearance, Batavia functioned as a colonial outpost deeply reliant on local networks. The VOC depended on supplies of rice, vegetables, timber, and labor from surrounding Javanese villages. In return, Dutch authorities issued contracts, tax exemptions, and protection for local elites who cooperated with the colonial system. These mutual dependencies created a layered structure of indirect rule. However, tensions often erupted beneath this surface. The Dutch were quick to use force when agreements failed, or when they perceived threats to their authority. One of the most significant examples came in the year 1641 when the VOC intervened in a succession crisis within the Sultanate of Banten, a rival trading port west of Batavia. The Dutch backed a claimant favorable to their interests and, in return, gained key trade privileges and security guarantees. These interventions in local politics became increasingly common. Throughout the 17th century, the VOC pursued a strategy of containment and alliance toward the central Javanese kingdom of Mataram. While the company preferred to avoid outright war with the powerful sultanate, it sought to limit its access to the coast and prevent any rival from threatening Batavia. The VOC supported coastal lords and rival claimants, supplied arms to rebellious factions, and restricted trade routes through fortifications and patrols. This strategy came to a head in the late 17th and early 18th centuries during the Trunajaya Rebellion, which erupted in the year 1674. A nobleman named Trunajaya from the eastern part of Java led a massive uprising against the Sultan of Mataram, capturing key cities and threatening to topple the kingdom entirely. The VOC, fearing the collapse of their indirect partner, intervened militarily. Dutch troops helped restore the Sultan to power, but only in exchange for greater territorial and political concessions. This pattern, supporting local rulers in exchange for influence, was repeated again and again. Over the following decades, Dutch forces became deeply entangled in Javanese court politics, succession disputes, and civil wars. These interventions transformed the VOC from a trading company into a de facto colonial power. The company established garrisons across Java, collected tribute, and mediated royal successions. The shift from commerce to control was not entirely planned, nor was it smooth. The costs of military campaigns, fort construction, and administrative bureaucracy steadily increased. Company records from this period reflect growing concerns over corruption, inefficiency, and debt. Many VOC officials enriched themselves through private trade, illicit taxes, and bribes. Meanwhile, indigenous communities bore the burden of conscription, forced labor, and rising food prices. By the early 18th century, Java had become the most intensively governed part of the Dutch Asian Empire. Unlike other parts of the VOC network, such as Ceylon, the Cape, or the Japanese trading post at Deshima, Java demanded constant attention and intervention. It was no longer just a supplier of goods or a waypoint in long-distance trade. It was the territorial heart of the empire. One of the most tragic episodes of Dutch colonial rule in this period was the Batavia Massacre of 1645. Relations between the Dutch authorities and the city's large Chinese population had deteriorated due to rising taxes, social restrictions, and fears of rebellion. Rumors of an imminent uprising led the VOC to launch a brutal crackdown. Over the course of several days, thousands of Chinese residents were killed by soldiers and local militias. Survivors were expelled or relocated, and their neighborhoods were burned to the ground. The massacre was not only a humanitarian catastrophe, but also a signal of how volatile Dutch colonial rule had become. Despite the outward image of order and commerce, the VOC's presence in Java was built on fragile alliances and frequent violence. The company's reliance on divide and rule strategies ensured short-term stability but created long-term resentment. Amid this instability, Dutch officials continued to present their activities as civilizing and orderly. They built schools, churches, and hospitals for European settlers and Christianized locals. they introduced Dutch legal codes, albeit selectively. But these institutions were primarily designed to serve the interests of the VOC and its allies. Most Javanese remained excluded from meaningful participation in governance or economic planning. Culturally, the VOC period in Java produced a hybrid society, the Dutch language mixed with Malay and Javanese. Families of mixed descent, often children of Dutch officials and local women, formed a distinct Eurasian class known as Indo-Europeans. These communities often served as intermediaries in trade, administration, and diplomacy. By the mid-18th century, the limits of VOC power were becoming clear. The company's debts were mounting, and its control over the Javanese interior remained incomplete. While it maintained strongholds on the coast and influence in the courts, many inland regions remained under indirect rule or local autonomy. Resistance simmered in rural areas where new religious movements and charismatic leaders challenged both native elites and foreign control. The VOC's transformation in Java from merchant company to colonial ruler was emblematic of a broader trend in European overseas expansion. Commerce had led to conquest, and governance had become inseparable from profit. The very structure of the Dutch Empire was being reshaped by the realities of empire building on the ground. In the decades to come, these challenges would intensify. The VOC's grip on Java would tighten further, even as the company itself fell into decline. As new ideas about sovereignty, economics, and empire emerged in the late 18th century, the Dutch would be forced to confront a colonial legacy that had outgrown the original ambitions of trade and profit. While the Dutch East India Company extended Dutch influence across Asia, the Dutch West India Company helped forge another pillar of the empire, one built upon plantation agriculture and the transatlantic slave trade. From the Caribbean to northern South America and the coast of West Africa, the Dutch Republic's Atlantic Empire increasingly depended on a system of forced labor that supplied European markets with sugar, coffee, cacao, and other profitable commodities. The origins of Dutch involvement in slavery date back to the early 17th century, when the Dutch West India Company began challenging Portuguese and Spanish control of Atlantic trade routes. As Dutch ships captured forts along the West African coast and gained territory in the Caribbean and South America, they also entered the human trafficking networks that had been developed by Iberian powers decades earlier. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch had established a number of critical nodes in the Atlantic slave trade. Forts such as Elmina and Axum on the Gold Coast, in present-day Ghana, functioned as holding centers for enslaved Africans, many of whom were captured by rival African groups or local traders and sold to European merchants in exchange for firearms, textiles, alcohol, and metal goods. These individuals were then forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic to Dutch-controlled plantations in the Americas and Caribbean. Suriname, acquired from the English in the mid-17th century, quickly became a centerpiece of the Dutch plantation economy. Its hot, humid climate was ideal for growing sugarcane, which was in high demand throughout Europe. Sugar required intensive labor, and enslaved Africans were brought to Suriname in large numbers to clear fields, dig irrigation canals, and work the mills. Mortality rates were staggering due to overwork, disease, and brutal punishment. The plantation owners in Suriname, often absentee investors based in the Netherlands, maintained strict control over their workforce through a brutal regime of surveillance, violence, and dehumanization. Enslaved people lived in crowded quarters, received minimal food and medical care, and were subjected to severe punishments for resistance or escape. Despite these conditions, enslaved communities developed forms of solidarity and resistance, preserving African cultural practices and staging revolts when possible. One of the most significant acts of resistance was the formation of Maroon societies. These were communities of escaped enslaved people who fled into the dense interior forests of Suriname and organized themselves into independent villages. The Maroons maintained their freedom through guerrilla warfare, attacking plantations and disrupting colonial supply lines. They forged complex alliances with indigenous peoples and used their knowledge of the terrain to evade capture. Eventually, the Dutch colonial authorities were forced to negotiate with the Maroons. In the latter half of the 18th century, the Dutch signed treaties recognizing the autonomy of several Maroon groups in exchange for peace and the return of future escapees. These agreements reflected both the limits of Dutch power in the region and the resilience of those who resisted slavery. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, Dutch colonies such as Curaçao, Aruba, and Sint Eustatius played vital roles in the wider slave economy. Curaçao, in particular, served as a major slave trading port. Enslaved Africans were brought there, sold at auction, and then redistributed to Spanish colonies in the Americas. Because Spain prohibited non-Spanish merchants from trading directly with its colonies, Dutch traders used ports like Curaçao to circumvent these restrictions and profit as intermediaries. The island of Sint Eustatius, known for its bustling free port, became one of the busiest trading centers in the Caribbean. Although it did not have a large plantation sector itself, its role in distributing enslaved people, sugar, and weapons made it an economic powerhouse. During times of war, Sint Eustatius also served as a critical supplier to both neutral and belligerent powers, operating in the gray zones of imperial regulation. Beyond the Caribbean and South America, Dutch involvement in the slave trade extended into the Indian Ocean. Enslaved people from Madagascar, East Africa, and South Asia were transported to Batavia, Ceylon, and the Cape Colony. In Batavia, the labor force included enslaved people of various origins who worked in households, workshops, and farms. Slavery in the East Indies did not follow the plantation model, but was no less exploitative. By the 18th century, the Dutch Republic had become a major player in the global slave trade. It is estimated that Dutch ships were responsible for transporting hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Profits from this trade enriched Dutch investors, funded urban infrastructure, and supported the maintenance of the empire. Banks, insurers, and shipping firms in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Middelburg were all connected to the machinery of human exploitation. Within the Netherlands itself, public awareness of slavery remained limited. While some religious groups, particularly Mennonites and Quakers, criticized the practice on moral grounds, mainstream opinion largely accepted it as a necessary part of overseas commerce. The economic benefits were visible. Wealthy merchant families invested in canal houses, art collections, and civic institutions, often with capital that could be traced back to plantations or slave voyages. Still, the 18th century also witnessed early signs of change. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, natural rights, and human dignity prompted some thinkers to reconsider the legitimacy of slavery. Dutch intellectuals began publishing critiques, and abolitionist sentiments slowly gained ground, particularly among dissident Protestant groups. At the same time, enslaved people continued to resist their conditions in ways both large and small. Day-to-day acts of defiance, such as work slowdowns, sabotage, and cultural preservation, challenged the authority of plantation owners. Uprisings and mass escapes, while risky and often violently suppressed, demonstrated that the enslaved were never passive victims. They fought to retain autonomy, family connections, and dignity within an oppressive system. The Dutch reliance on slavery also made their colonies vulnerable. Revolts in other colonial empires, such as the Haitian Revolution in the French Caribbean, sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world. Dutch authorities feared similar uprisings and invested heavily in military outposts and surveillance networks to contain unrest. By the end of the 18th century, the Dutch Atlantic Empire remained profitable but increasingly strained. The Dutch West India Company, like its counterpart in the East, suffered from mismanagement, corruption, and declining competitiveness. Eventually, both companies would be dissolved, and the Dutch state would assume direct control over colonial governance. The legacy of the slave trade and plantation economy continued to shape the Dutch Empire and society. It enriched generations of investors and institutions, but it also left deep scars, economic, cultural, and human. The forced movement of people, the destruction of communities, and the entrenchment of racial hierarchies were central features of Dutch colonialism, not peripheral. In recent years, this legacy has become the subject of public reckoning and historical inquiry. Monuments, archives, and museum exhibits in the Netherlands now seek to confront the country's role in slavery, while descendants of enslaved peoples continue to call for recognition and justice. For nearly 2 centuries, the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC, had been the engine of Dutch imperial expansion in Asia. It built forts, negotiated treaties, conducted wars, and generated immense profits from spices, textiles, and trade networks that spanned continents. But by the 18th century, the company's fortunes began to falter. A combination of bureaucratic inefficiency, endemic corruption, rising costs, and shifting geopolitical dynamics slowly eroded its power. The 18th century began with the VOC still dominant in Southeast Asia. It held strategic ports across the Indian Ocean, maintained garrisons on Java, and controlled the spice trade from the Moluccas. Batavia remained its administrative hub, with an elaborate colonial apparatus that managed everything from trade tariffs to civil law. Yet behind this outward display of stability, the company's foundation was already weakening. The first and perhaps most fundamental problem was financial. Unlike the rapid profits of earlier decades, the company now found itself burdened with high operating costs. Its far-flung network of ships, forts, and soldiers required enormous sums to maintain. Salaries, pensions, and payments to local allies consumed increasing portions of the company's income. Additionally, its once lucrative spice monopolies had lost much of their profitability. Global markets had changed. Other European powers had entered the trade, and the demand for cloves and nutmeg had diminished compared to previous centuries. At the same time, the VOC's internal structure became a liability. The company was governed by a central board called the Heren 17th, composed of representatives from several Dutch cities. This board often struggled to make swift decisions or implement reforms across such a vast territory. Power was also dispersed among regional chambers, each of which had its own interests and patrons. Local officials in Asia often acted independently, forming private trade agreements, diverting funds, or using company resources for personal gain. Corruption was rampant. VOC officials stationed in distant posts had wide discretionary power and limited oversight. Many enriched themselves through side deals with local merchants, unauthorized trade, or exploitation of local populations. Investigations and reforms were sporadic and largely ineffective. The company's own records reflect growing concern among directors in Amsterdam about declining revenues and the apparent inability to control their agents abroad. Meanwhile, geopolitical developments placed further strain on the VOC. The 18th century saw the rise of British power in India, especially after the Battle of Plassey and the establishment of the British East India Company as a territorial ruler. The French also remained active competitors, especially in the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Dutch outposts, once key to controlling trade routes, became increasingly vulnerable. Compounding these external threats were shifts within Asia itself. In Java, the VOC had long maintained its influence by intervening in local dynastic disputes and supporting cooperative sultans. But these strategies required continual military campaigns and financial subsidies. Rebellions, palace intrigues, and shifting alliances forced the Dutch to become more directly involved in governance. As a result, the company found itself drawn deeper into administrative responsibilities it was not designed to handle. A particularly illustrative example was the series of conflicts in the interior of Java during the mid-18th century. After the Trunajaya rebellion, the VOC continued to insert itself into Javanese court politics, eventually partitioning the royal family into rival courts. This arrangement created a patchwork of client states, each dependent on Dutch protection but also prone to instability. Maintaining this fragile balance drained company resources and further complicated governance. Beyond Java, the VOC struggled to hold on to its remaining outposts. In Sri Lanka, the Dutch clashed with the Kingdom of Kandy, which resisted European control of the interior. In the Malabar coast and Coromandel regions of India, Dutch influence waned as British forces expanded. Even in places like Malacca and Makassar, Dutch garrisons faced logistical difficulties and local resistance. All the while, the VOC's performance in its core mission, commerce, continued to deteriorate. Its ships, once sleek and swift, were now outpaced by British and French vessels. Its factories produced declining returns. Shareholders in the Netherlands, who had once enjoyed generous dividends, grew frustrated with the company's losses and erratic financial reports. In response to the crisis, the Dutch government began to take a more active role. Over the course of the 18th century, the line between private and public colonial authority blurred. The States General, increasingly aware that the VOC's collapse could damage national prestige and economic stability, began to intervene more frequently in company affairs. Military support, tax adjustments, and personnel appointments were all influenced by government officials in The Hague. The final blow came in the last 2 decades of the century. The French Revolutionary Wars, which erupted in Europe in the 1790s, disrupted maritime commerce and plunged the Dutch Republic into political turmoil. The French invaded the Netherlands in 1795, establishing the Batavian Republic, a client state aligned with French revolutionary ideals. Under the new regime, the Dutch government seized full control of overseas colonies and dissolved the VOC in the year 1799. With its charter revoked, the once mighty company came to an end. Its assets, liabilities, and territories were transferred to the Dutch state, marking the beginning of a new phase in the history of the empire. The age of private corporate empire had passed. In its place rose a colonial system managed directly by the state. The consequences of this transition were profound. Dutch colonialism became more centralized, bureaucratic, and overtly political. In the Indies, the government retained many VOC structures, offices, military units, and legal codes, but placed them under civil administrators appointed from the Netherlands. The language of empire shifted as well. While the VOC had justified its rule in terms of trade and profit, state colonialism now embraced discourses of modernization, civilizing missions, and imperial duty. For indigenous populations across Dutch colonies, the end of the VOC brought little immediate relief. Forced labor, taxation, and economic control continued, often with greater efficiency. In Java, where the Dutch held the strongest grip, the colonial state expanded land surveys, road construction, and cash crop production. In other territories, Dutch rule remained indirect but firm, buttressed by military force and strategic alliances. Yet the fall of the VOC also opened the door to new critiques. Enlightenment ideas about human rights, government accountability, and economic fairness began to circulate more widely in Dutch society. Although these ideas did not immediately alter colonial practice, they planted the seeds for future debates over slavery, labor, and colonial legitimacy. Back in the Netherlands, the VOC's demise provoked public reflection. What had begun as a pioneering enterprise, admired for its innovation, ambition, and reach, had ended in debt, scandal, and failure. Historians, poets, and politicians debated whether the decline had been inevitable or the result of greed and mismanagement. Museums and paintings continued to celebrate the VOC's golden age, but a more complex legacy was beginning to emerge. The fall of the VOC marked a turning point not only in Dutch imperial history, but in the broader story of European colonialism. It revealed the limitations of corporate empire and foreshadowed a new era in which states would take direct control of colonial territories. The Dutch state now stood as the sole authority in the East Indies and beyond, setting the stage for deeper entrenchment of colonial systems in the 19th century. As the 18th century drew to a close, the Dutch Empire entered a turbulent period of disruption and transformation. Political revolutions in Europe, combined with wars of unprecedented scale, would unsettle Dutch rule both at home and overseas. The collapse of the Dutch East India Company had already signaled a shift in the structure of empire, from corporate dominance to state control, but the Napoleonic era would bring even deeper changes. During this time, the Dutch would lose much of their global empire, only to reclaim and reorganize it in a dramatically altered world. The trigger for this transformation came in the year 1795, when French revolutionary armies invaded the Dutch Republic. The ruling regime was replaced by the Batavian Republic, a client state aligned with revolutionary France. Although the new republic promised reform and modernization, its foreign policy was effectively dictated by the French government. The once independent Dutch Republic had become a satellite of Paris, and the old balance of political power was broken. Under the Batavian Republic, the Netherlands adopted a more centralized form of government, abolished hereditary offices, and introduced a new constitution. These reforms, though significant, were overshadowed by the larger geopolitical consequences of the French Revolutionary Wars. Dutch ships, trade routes, and colonies became targets for Britain, which now regarded the Netherlands as an enemy state under French influence. In response, the British launched a series of military campaigns aimed at seizing Dutch overseas possessions. These campaigns were remarkably effective. Between the late 1790s and the early years of the 19th century, Britain captured most of the Dutch colonial empire, including key holdings in the Caribbean, South Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. The Cape Colony, situated at the southern tip of Africa, was of particular strategic importance. Originally a resupply station for Dutch ships en route to the East Indies, it had grown into a small settler colony. In 1795, the British occupied the Cape to prevent it from falling into French hands. Although they briefly returned it to the Dutch under the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, they reoccupied it in 1806 and would never give it back. Elsewhere, British forces took control of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, seized Dutch outposts in India, and targeted VOC trading posts in the East Indies. While some of these territories were temporarily held or contested, the overall effect was clear. The Dutch colonial empire had fractured under the pressure of war. Back in Europe, Dutch politics continued to evolve under French dominance. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte installed his brother, Louis Bonaparte, as king of the newly created Kingdom of Holland. Although Louis attempted to act in the interests of his Dutch subjects, learning the language and adopting local customs, he was ultimately unable to assert independence from his brother's will. In 1810, Napoleon dissolved the Kingdom of Holland altogether and annexed the Dutch territories directly into the French Empire. This annexation brought the Netherlands fully under French rule. Dutch men were conscripted into Napoleon's armies, Dutch ports were drawn into the continental system, a blockade against British trade, and French administrative systems were imposed across the country. While some reforms, such as standardized taxation and legal codes, had long-term effects, they also deepened Dutch resentment of foreign control. Amid these upheavals, the Dutch monarchy in exile, led by the House of Orange, waited for an opportunity to return. That opportunity came in 1813 when Napoleon's military fortunes began to collapse following his failed invasion of Russia. As French troops withdrew from the Low Countries, a popular uprising in Amsterdam led to the proclamation of Dutch independence. Soon after, Prince William of Orange returned from exile and assumed leadership as sovereign prince of the Netherlands. With Napoleon's final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe. The Netherlands was reconstituted as the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, now including modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal was to create a strong buffer state against future French aggression. But for the Dutch, the restoration also meant reclaiming what remained of their overseas empire. Although Britain had captured most of the Dutch colonies during the wars, diplomatic agreements following the conflict returned several key territories to Dutch control. Java, the heart of the former VOC holdings, was handed back in 1816, along with parts of the Moluccas and Sumatra. However, some territories, including the Cape Colony and Ceylon, remained permanently in British hands. The return of Java marked a critical turning point. Dutch administrators, many of whom had no prior experience in Asia, faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding colonial authority in a changed world. The Javanese political landscape had shifted during the British occupation, which had introduced land reforms, limited forced labor, and challenged existing power structures. British officials like Thomas Stamford Raffles had implemented policies that, though short-lived, disrupted the status quo. When the Dutch returned, they were forced to reconsider how they would govern their colonies. The days of company rule and private enrichment had passed. The new colonial state would be more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more directly connected to national interests. Yet this transition did not mean an end to exploitation. In fact, as the 19th century unfolded, the Dutch would introduce new systems of forced labor and economic extraction under the guise of reform. One of the key legacies of the Napoleonic era was the increased role of the Dutch state in managing colonial affairs. The dissolution of both the Dutch East and West India companies had already concentrated imperial power in the hands of the government. Now, with the restoration of peace and the reorganization of empire, the Dutch began to formalize their colonial administration through new ministries, legal codes, and civil service positions. The Napoleonic period also altered Dutch self-perception. No longer the merchant republic of the 17th century, the Netherlands was now a constitutional monarchy seeking to modernize its institutions and compete with larger European powers. The empire was no longer a series of private trading ventures, but a component of national identity and state policy. At the same time, the costs of empire had become more visible. Military defeats, economic disruptions, and the human toll of slavery and forced labor prompted growing debates in Dutch society. While abolitionist sentiment remained relatively weak in the early 19th century, intellectuals and reformers began to question the moral and practical foundations of colonial rule. The First Dutch Empire, built on trade, private enterprise, and maritime supremacy, had largely collapsed under the weight of European conflict. But out of its ruins, a new imperial structure was beginning to emerge, one based on direct rule, centralized administration, and the systematic exploitation of colonial labor and land. In the years to come, this restructured empire would be tested by internal revolts, global competition, and shifting ideologies. But for the moment, the Dutch state stood poised to reassert its presence on the world stage, determined to reclaim its status through a new phase of colonial expansion and control. With the fall of Napoleon and the restoration of the Dutch monarchy in the early 19th century, the Netherlands sought to re-establish itself as a colonial power. Though weakened by war and humbled by the temporary loss of its empire, the Dutch returned to Asia with a determination to reclaim authority, secure resources, and restore economic relevance. Now operating under a modernizing state rather than a chartered company, the Dutch colonial administration introduced a new system of rule in the East Indies, one that would be as profitable as it was controversial. Central to this effort was the island of Java, which had long been the administrative and economic heart of Dutch ambitions in Southeast Asia. During the British occupation from the early 1800s to the year 1816, several important reforms had been introduced. The British official Thomas Stamford Raffles had attempted to abolish forced labor, reorganize land ownership, and increase revenue through a system of land taxes. These policies, though only partially implemented, disrupted long-standing relationships between Dutch administrators, Javanese elites, and local populations. When the Dutch resumed control of Java in the year 1816, they faced a changed landscape. The colonial government, now directly under the control of The Hague, moved to reassert authority while learning from the disruptions caused during British rule. For a time, Dutch officials attempted to maintain the reforms introduced by Raffles, including the land tax system. However, they quickly discovered that this approach generated limited revenue and encountered strong resistance from both rural farmers and local nobility. In response, the Dutch devised a new system, one that would transform the colonial economy and reshape the daily lives of millions of Javanese people. This was the cultivation system, or cultuurstelsel in Dutch, introduced officially in the year 1830 under the leadership of Governor-General Johannes van den Bosch. The policy was framed as a means of restoring order, alleviating budget deficits, and improving the productivity of colonial land. In practice, it created a highly exploitative regime of forced agricultural labor. Under the cultivation system, Javanese villages were required to devote a fixed portion of their land, usually 1/5, to growing export crops designated by the Dutch government. These included sugar, coffee, indigo, and later tea. The harvested crops were then sold to the colonial authorities at fixed, low prices and shipped to the Netherlands for profit. In addition to the land requirement, villagers were also compelled to contribute a portion of their labor, typically unpaid, for plantation work, transport, or maintenance of colonial infrastructure. This system offered the Dutch treasury a dramatic boost. Revenues from Java surged, and by the mid-19th century, the East Indies had become a primary source of income for the Dutch state. These profits, known as the betigslot, or surplus, were used to reduce national debt, finance railways and canals in Europe, and subsidize domestic programs. The cultivation system effectively turned Java into a financial lifeline for the Netherlands. But this wealth came at a profound cost. The forced cultivation of export crops displaced local food production, contributing to periodic famines. In years of poor harvest or natural disaster, villagers who were obligated to grow cash crops could not meet their own subsistence needs. In some areas, such as Central Java, food shortages became chronic. Malnutrition, disease, and social dislocation followed. The system also reinforced and deepened existing hierarchies. Dutch administrators relied on local elites, regents, village heads, and traditional aristocrats to enforce cultivation quotas and labor requirements. These intermediaries were often rewarded with privileges, exemptions, and a share of the profits, making them complicit in the exploitation of their own communities. While this strategy allowed for efficient governance, it also created lasting divisions within Javanese society. Despite these realities, the cultivation system was presented in official Dutch narratives as a civilizing project. Colonial administrators argued that it brought discipline, order, and economic progress to Java. Reports emphasized improvements in irrigation, road building, and the growth of agricultural knowledge. However, these accounts rarely acknowledge the coercion, suffering, and resistance embedded in the system. Some of the strongest critiques came from within Dutch society itself. In the 1860s, a former colonial official named Edward Douws Dekker, writing under the pen name Multatuli, published a novel titled Max Havelaar. The book told the story of a Dutch civil servant who struggled against the corruption and injustice of colonial rule in Java. Through satire, drama, and vivid characterization, Multatuli exposed the human cost of the cultivation system and the hypocrisy of those who profited from it. Max Havelaar caused a sensation. It challenged the complacency of Dutch middle-class readers and sparked a broader public debate about colonial policy. While some dismissed the novel as exaggerated, others recognized its emotional force and moral urgency. The book played a critical role in changing public perception and laying the groundwork for later reforms. Outside the realm of literature, criticism of the cultivation system also emerged from economists, missionaries, and members of parliament. By the mid-19th century, liberal voices within Dutch politics began advocating for a more ethical and market-oriented approach to colonial governance. They argued that forced labor was incompatible with modern economic theory and violated the principles of free trade and human dignity. In response to growing pressure, the Dutch government began to dismantle the cultivation system gradually. Coffee cultivation was liberalized first, followed by sugar and indigo. By the 1870s, most of the system had been replaced by a regime of private plantation capitalism and contract labor. However, the legacies of exploitation, land concentration, rural poverty, and the entrenchment of colonial authority remained firmly in place. During this transitional period, the Dutch also expanded their control beyond Java. Using a combination of treaties, military expeditions, and economic incentives, colonial authorities extended their influence to Sumatra, Borneo, and the outer islands of the archipelago. The logic of the cultivation system, state-directed economic extraction, continued to shape these ventures, even as the specific policies evolved. In Java, the end of the cultivation system did not mean an end to hardship. The rise of private estates introduced new forms of labor coercion. Many villagers entered into debt contracts or wage agreements that bound them to plantations under highly unequal terms. While the Dutch no longer compelled crop production through government quotas, the economic structure remained heavily biased in favor of European capital and colonial control. Education and health services were minimal, and indigenous participation in governance was negligible. The civil service remained overwhelmingly Dutch, and even as economic liberalism replaced state monopolies, the principle of racial and cultural superiority continued to guide policy. The idea of the ethical policy, which would later promise moral responsibility and social investment, had not yet taken hold. Still, the end of the cultivation system marked a turning point in Dutch colonial history. It exposed the contradictions of empire, triggered public debate, and revealed the limits of economic extraction without reform. For many in the Netherlands, it was a moment of reckoning, a recognition that the empire could not be sustained indefinitely through coercion and exploitation alone. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Dutch colonial empire had reached both a geographic and administrative peak. Control over the Indonesian archipelago was expanding steadily, and the last vestiges of the cultivation system were being phased out. Yet, beneath this veneer of order, the empire was entering a new and more complicated phase. Dutch officials faced mounting resistance from indigenous populations, while liberal reformers in the Netherlands began to question the ethical legitimacy of continued colonial rule. These twin pressures, resistance from below and reform from within, would begin to reshape the trajectory of Dutch colonialism. As Dutch authority spread beyond Java, it encountered a patchwork of indigenous polities, each with distinct cultures, traditions, and forms of governance. In some regions, Dutch officials sought to integrate local rulers through treaties and indirect rule. In others, they used military force to bring territories under formal colonial administration. The outer islands, Sumatra, Bali, Sulawesi, and parts of Borneo, became focal points for this process of consolidation. One of the most notable episodes of resistance occurred in central Sumatra with the outbreak of the Aceh War in the year 1873. The Sultanate of Aceh, located on the northern tip of the island, had long maintained its independence and controlled critical trade routes through the Malacca Strait. When the Dutch attempted to assert control through a combination of diplomacy and threats, the Acehnese responded with armed resistance. What began as a conventional conflict quickly evolved into a protracted guerrilla war. Acehnese fighters, including religious leaders known as ulama, organized decentralized bands of resistance that used their knowledge of the terrain to frustrate Dutch advances. The Dutch, expecting a quick victory, found themselves bogged down in a brutal and costly campaign that lasted more than 3 decades. The Aceh War became one of the bloodiest episodes in the history of Dutch imperialism. Thousands of Dutch soldiers died from disease and combat, while tens of thousands of Acehnese were killed or displaced. The Dutch deployed scorched earth tactics, burned villages, and used collective punishment against civilians suspected of supporting the rebels. Although Dutch forces eventually occupied Acehnese cities and declared victory, pockets of resistance continued into the 20th century. Elsewhere in the archipelago, resistance took different forms. In Bali, Dutch interventions in local succession disputes and attempts to impose political control led to a series of violent confrontations. In the late 19th century, Dutch troops launched multiple invasions, culminating in the so-called puputan, or ritual mass suicides of Balinese royalty and their followers, who chose death over submission. These events shocked Dutch public opinion and fueled criticism of colonial brutality. While resistance in the outer islands often involved military confrontation in Java and other long-administered areas, opposition was more subtle but no less significant. Rural communities resisted new taxes, wage labor regimes, and the expansion of plantation agriculture through quiet defiance, migration, and occasional protest. These acts rarely made headlines, but they chipped away at the myth of passive colonial subjects. At the same time, a new generation of educated Indonesians began to emerge. products of limited schooling opportunities introduced by the Dutch. Missionary schools, Islamic pesantren, and Dutch-run primary institutions produced a small but growing class of literate Javanese, Minangkabau, and Ambonese individuals who found employment as teachers, clerks, and minor administrators. These individuals began to articulate grievances, question colonial authority, and call for reforms. In the Netherlands, colonial policy was also being re-evaluated. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals, economic liberalism, and the growing body of humanitarian literature, Dutch intellectuals and politicians increasingly challenged the exploitation that had defined earlier colonial rule. The publication of Max Havelaar in the 1860s continued to shape public discourse well into the following decades. These developments culminated in the emergence of what became known as the ethical policy. While it would not be fully formalized until the early 20th century, the roots of this new direction can be traced to the final decades of the 19th century. Advocates of the ethical policy argued that the Netherlands had a moral responsibility to improve the welfare of its colonial subjects. They believed that education, agricultural modernization, and limited political inclusion were necessary both to uplift the population and to justify continued imperial presence. Although the ethical policy was promoted as a humanitarian shift, it was also a strategic response to unrest and international criticism. European empires faced increasing scrutiny for their treatment of indigenous peoples, and imperial reformers sought to reconcile colonialism with emerging global norms about progress and civilization. For the Dutch, implementing reforms in the East Indies became a way to retain legitimacy while avoiding the revolutionary upheavals seen elsewhere. In practice, however, reform proceeded slowly and unevenly. New schools were built, but they reached only a small fraction of the population. Curricula emphasized loyalty to the Dutch crown and taught basic literacy and vocational skills. Political participation remained extremely limited, and most decision-making continued to reside in the hands of Dutch officials. Some agricultural reforms were introduced, including irrigation projects and crop diversification programs. But these efforts often served the interests of export-oriented economies rather than local food security. Land tenure laws were restructured in ways that favored European planters and wealthy indigenous elites, marginalizing smallholders and subsistence farmers. Yet, despite these limitations, the ethical policy marked a shift in rhetoric and aspiration. For the first time, Dutch colonial authorities explicitly framed their mission in terms of responsibility rather than profit. This shift opened up new spaces for debate and gave Indonesian reformers a framework through which to express their demands. One of the most important outcomes of this transitional period was the gradual emergence of early nationalist sentiment. While still fragmented and cautious, educated Indonesians began forming associations, publishing newspapers, and discussing issues of justice, identity, and political rights. The seeds of future nationalist movements were being planted, quietly but steadily. By the end of the 19th century, the Dutch colonial empire stood at a crossroads. It had achieved its widest territorial reach, with formal control extending across most of the Indonesian archipelago. Dutch officials governed a vast and diverse population, supported by a growing infrastructure of roads, ports, railways, and bureaucracies. The illusion of order appeared secure, but beneath this surface, powerful currents were beginning to gather. The resilience of indigenous resistance, the rise of an educated class, and the contradictions of colonial reform all pointed toward a future in which Dutch rule would be increasingly contested. The next century would bring world wars, independence movements, and a final reckoning with the legacies of empire. As the 20th century began, the Dutch colonial empire stood at a moment of uneasy strength. Spanning vast territories and housing tens of millions of colonial subjects, it appeared on the surface to be a model of European control. Dutch administrators oversaw plantations, schools, ports, and a growing bureaucracy. Yet beneath the structured calm of empire, a new century brought with it global shocks that would test the foundations of Dutch rule like never before. The First World War, which erupted in 1914, marked the beginning of that unraveling process. Though the Netherlands remained officially neutral during the conflict, the war had significant effects on its colonies, particularly in the Dutch East Indies. Global trade routes were disrupted, inflation spiked, and supplies from Europe became scarce. Economic instability and food shortages followed, fueling unrest and labor strikes across Java and Sumatra. More importantly, the war accelerated political consciousness. Indonesians, observing the chaos engulfing the European powers, began to question the invincibility of colonial rule. The ideals of self-determination and national sovereignty, which were part of the rhetoric used by leaders like Woodrow Wilson, resonated far beyond Europe. In the Dutch East Indies, these ideas took root among a small but growing number of educated Indonesians, who began organizing associations and publishing newspapers in local languages. The first major nationalist movement to emerge in this era was Sarekat Islam, a mass-based organization founded in the early 20th century. Originally a commercial cooperative to support Muslim merchants, it quickly evolved into a political platform calling for greater rights, cultural pride, and economic fairness. With branches across Java and hundreds of thousands of members, Sarekat Islam demonstrated that popular mobilization was possible under colonial conditions. In response, the Dutch colonial administration attempted to balance repression with limited reform. Press censorship was tightened, and suspected radicals were arrested or exiled. At the same time, officials expanded education programs and created advisory councils that included carefully selected indigenous elites. These measures, however, were designed more to contain nationalism than to empower it. The interwar years saw the further development of Indonesian political thought. Organizations such as the Indonesian National Party, founded by Sukarno in the late 1920s, called directly for independence. These movements were influenced not only by domestic conditions but also by global developments. The anti-colonial writings of Indian and Chinese thinkers, the growing strength of labor movements, and the decline of European prestige after the war. Dutch responses varied. Some liberal administrators advocated for gradual reform and greater inclusion of Indonesians in governance. Others warned against conceding too much, fearing it would encourage separatism. The overall approach remained cautious and paternalistic. By the end of the 1930s, the colonial government still held firm control, but its legitimacy was weakening. Then came the Second World War, which would shatter the empire's illusion of permanence. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands and occupied the country for 5 years. The Dutch government fled into exile in London, while back in Europe, Dutch citizens endured hardship, repression, and resistance. But the greater shock to the empire came when Japan entered the war and swept through Southeast Asia with unprecedented speed. In early 1942, Japanese forces invaded the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch colonial army, poorly prepared and vastly outnumbered, surrendered within weeks. The entire archipelago fell under Japanese military occupation. For the first time in over 300 years, the Dutch had lost control of their most important colony. The Japanese occupation was brutal. Forced labor, food shortages, and political repression were widespread. But paradoxically, the occupation also created conditions for future independence. The Japanese dismantled Dutch colonial institutions, promoted indigenous leadership, and encouraged anti-European sentiment. Indonesian nationalists, including Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, were allowed to organize under Japanese oversight, giving them administrative experience and broader recognition. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a power vacuum emerged in the East Indies. On August 17th, 2 days after Japan's official capitulation, Sukarno and Hatta declared Indonesian independence in Jakarta. A new republic was proclaimed, marking the beginning of a fierce and complex struggle that would last for 4 more years. The Dutch, emerging from wartime devastation and occupation in Europe, were determined to reclaim their former colony. Dutch leaders viewed the Indonesian declaration as illegitimate and sought to restore colonial rule. However, the world had changed. The idea of empire now faced growing opposition both internationally and within the Netherlands itself. British forces initially intervened to disarm Japanese troops and maintain order, but they quickly found themselves caught between Dutch demands and Indonesian resistance. The Indonesian National Revolution, as it came to be known, was fought with a mix of guerrilla warfare, diplomatic pressure, and mass mobilization. Indonesian republicans controlled large parts of Java and Sumatra, though the Dutch retained control of many urban centers and ports. Between 1947 and 1949, the Dutch launched two major military offensives, referred to euphemistically as police actions, to suppress the Indonesian Republic. Though militarily successful in the short term, these operations sparked international outrage. Reports of violence, civilian casualties, and Dutch repression drew condemnation from newly independent nations, international media, and even members of the United Nations. The United States, which had supported Dutch reconstruction through the Marshall Plan, began to pressure the Netherlands to negotiate. American officials feared that continued conflict in Indonesia would drive the republic toward communism and destabilize the region. The United Nations intervened diplomatically, and under growing global pressure, the Dutch agreed to transfer sovereignty. On December 27, 1949, the Netherlands formally recognized Indonesian independence through the Round Table Conference agreements. The Dutch East Indies, once the crown jewel of the empire, had now become the Republic of Indonesia. It was a profound moment of transition, not only for Indonesians who had fought for self-determination, but for the Dutch, who were forced to confront the collapse of their imperial ambitions. The loss of Indonesia marked the symbolic and practical end of the first phase of Dutch colonialism. Though the Netherlands retained control over smaller overseas territories such as Suriname and the Caribbean islands, the psychological center of empire had shifted. The 20th century had delivered a devastating verdict on colonial rule. It was no longer sustainable, either morally or politically. In the Netherlands, the decolonization of Indonesia prompted a period of introspection and debate. Some viewed it as a necessary and overdue correction. Others, particularly colonial veterans and administrators, struggled to reconcile with the loss. Dutch society had to absorb returning colonists, soldiers, and thousands of Indo-European refugees whose lives had been shaped by empire and now faced uncertain futures. In Indonesia, independence brought its own challenges. The legacy of colonial rule, deep social inequality, limited infrastructure, and fractured institutions would shape the nation's post-colonial development. Yet the act of winning independence through struggle provided a powerful foundation for national identity. The era of high empire was over. In its place emerged a new world of independent nations, global institutions, and evolving relationships between former colonizers and the newly sovereign states. The formal end of Dutch rule in Indonesia in the year 1949 marked the collapse of one of Europe's most enduring colonial empires. Yet, empires do not vanish entirely with the lowering of a flag or the signing of a treaty. In the decades that followed, the legacies of the Dutch Empire continued to shape both the Netherlands and its former colonies in profound and sometimes unexpected ways, through migration, culture, economic relationships, and the evolving politics of memory. Following the recognition of Indonesian independence, the Netherlands faced a complex and immediate human consequence: the repatriation and resettlement of tens of thousands of people who had lived under the colonial system. Among them were Dutch administrators, military personnel, settlers, and Indo-Europeans, people of mixed Dutch and Indonesian ancestry who had for generations formed an important part of colonial society. Many of them no longer felt safe or welcome in the new republic and sought refuge in the Netherlands. Their arrival marked one of the largest waves of post-war migration in Dutch history. The newcomers often struggled to find acceptance and integration in Dutch society. Many carried with them a deep sense of dislocation, having lost not only their homes, but also the privileged status they once held in the colonies. Settled in temporary housing or purpose-built neighborhoods, these migrants brought with them colonial memories, food traditions, and hybrid identities that would gradually influence Dutch cultural life. In the decades that followed, New waves of migration added to this story. Workers from Suriname and the Dutch Caribbean islands, such as Curaçao, Aruba, and Sint Maarten, began to migrate to the Netherlands in growing numbers, particularly during the 1950s and 1960s. Their movements were shaped by ongoing colonial connections, even as these territories moved toward varying degrees of autonomy or independence. Suriname, once a lucrative plantation colony reliant on enslaved labor, became independent in the year 1975. In the years leading up to and following independence, many Surinamese citizens moved to the Netherlands, anticipating political uncertainty or seeking economic opportunity. Today, people of Surinamese descent form one of the largest post-colonial communities in the Netherlands, contributing significantly to Dutch politics, arts, sports, and business. The Caribbean territories followed a different path. Rather than becoming fully independent, they entered into new constitutional arrangements as parts of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This created complex relationships between these island societies and the Dutch state, marked by shared citizenship, economic dependence, and ongoing debates about autonomy and representation. These islands remain deeply connected to the Netherlands, but tensions around inequality and cultural difference continue to emerge. Migration from former colonies has brought richness and diversity to Dutch society, but it has also raised difficult questions about national identity. In a country long associated with tolerance and pragmatism, discussions around race, colonial history, and integration have grown increasingly charged. Post-colonial communities often find themselves navigating both a longing for recognition and the challenges of systemic inequality. These tensions are not only demographic but also historical. The legacy of the Dutch Empire, once celebrated as a story of trade, maritime prowess, and exploration, is now the subject of critical scrutiny. Historians, artists, activists, and educators have challenged earlier narratives that romanticized colonial ventures while ignoring their human cost. One of the most visible aspects of this reckoning has been the debate over public memory. Statues of colonial figures, once symbols of national pride, have become flashpoints for protest and reflection. Streets and institutions named after VOC officers or colonial governors are being renamed or reinterpreted. Museums have launched major exhibitions that confront the violence, exploitation, and cultural suppression of empire. The Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, once a showcase for ethnographic collections gathered from colonial territories, has transformed its mission in recent years to center on dialogue, inclusion, and decolonization. Artworks, artifacts, and archives are now presented not as trophies of conquest, but as complex symbols of cultural exchange, appropriation, and survival. In academic and political spheres, efforts have been made to research and acknowledge the full scope of colonial injustice. The Dutch government has commissioned reports on the use of violence during the Indonesian War of Independence and offered official apologies for specific incidents, including massacres carried out by Dutch forces. These gestures, while important, have not always satisfied those seeking broader recognition, reparations, or educational reform. One of the most persistent calls has been for a fuller reckoning with the history of slavery. For centuries, the Dutch played a central role in the transatlantic slave trade, transporting hundreds of thousands of Africans to plantations in Suriname, the Caribbean, and the Americas. While the Netherlands abolished slavery in the year 1863, public awareness of this history remained limited until recent decades. In response to advocacy from descendants of enslaved communities and anti-racist movements, the Dutch state has begun to acknowledge this past more openly. In the year 2023, the Dutch king issued a formal apology for the Netherlands' role in slavery, recognizing the lasting pain and inequality caused by this legacy. Educational institutions have expanded their curriculum to include colonial history, and cultural events such as Keti Koti, a day of remembrance and emancipation, have gained greater national prominence. Despite these efforts, challenges remain. Critics argue that apologies must be matched with structural change, including investment in marginalized communities and the return of cultural heritage items taken during the colonial period. Others question whether the Dutch public has truly come to terms with the complexities of its imperial history, or whether old myths and silences continue to shape collective memory. Still, the conversation is ongoing. Artists, writers, and filmmakers with roots in the former colonies are reshaping Dutch cultural life with new voices and perspectives. Politicians of post-colonial descent have risen to national prominence, reflecting the changing face of the Netherlands. Grassroots initiatives, academic programs, and social movements continue to push for justice, remembrance, and a more inclusive understanding of the past. Meanwhile, economic and diplomatic relationships with former colonies continue to evolve. The Netherlands maintains development partnerships with Suriname and the Caribbean islands, supports cultural exchange programs, and engages in bilateral cooperation across trade, education, and environmental issues. These relationships are no longer defined by dominance, but by negotiation, complexity, and shared histories. In Indonesia, the Dutch colonial period remains a source of reflection and scholarship. While the memory of Dutch rule is often marked by pain and resistance, it is also part of the fabric of Indonesia's national story. Monuments, museums, and literature across the archipelago recall the struggles for independence and the challenges of post-colonial development. Today, the Dutch Empire exists not as a geopolitical entity, but as a historical legacy, woven into the lives, identities, and institutions of people around the world. From the canals of Amsterdam to the rice fields of Java, from Surinamese music festivals to Caribbean parliaments, the traces of empire persist. The task of confronting that legacy remains unfinished. It involves not only acknowledging past wrongs, but also imagining a future grounded in equity, dialogue, and respect. As the Netherlands continues to navigate its post-colonial journey, it is increasingly clear that the story of the Dutch Empire is not just a story of the past. It is a living history that continues to shape the present.